Greetings. I am Darth Aod. I have come to you now, after many years of hiding in silence behind Darshad Gaia, to discuss something that, I'll admit, I'm a little nervous about talking about. My comrade talked about this concept during Metal Gear Solid, the idea of being nervous because it was a work that had been well tried, and the uncertainty as if anything new could be added to something that has been so discussed. But it was heavily requested, and so he acquiesced. By similarity, I am not certain that I can add anything to the discussion of Star Wars, one of the things that has, in my opinion, been discussed more than any other single thing throughout the course of geek culture. But it was heavily requested, and so here I am. One thing to get out of the way right off the bat. Yes, I will be considering the Extended Universe as canon for the sake of this video and the next 5 videos which will be following, because of course I will. One other thing of note here. You may or may not find this funny. I have these new notepads procured for me by our Shingai's sister. Lots more note-taking room than the old ones I used, right? These are the notes I have for Phantome Menace. Yeah, I think you get the point. So let's begin. Very first thing I want to mention is, yes, I do still enjoy Phantome Menace. Having rewatched it for this period of time and putting on analysis mode, I have to admit, it's actually dropped a little bit in my overall preference and enjoyment, and I'll try to discuss why as we go throughout, but it is still a movie I feel is still a net positive, if only barely. In many ways, Phantome Menace reminds me of Star Trek Voyager. It has a great deal of potential and a lot of things going for it, but it never actually capitalizes on that potential and fails in many significant ways. Another thing that I have to mention here is that, you know what, I'm just going to put my glasses back on. And then suddenly, Darth Aod was submerged so our Shingaya can see again. There we go. Okay, another thing to mention here, yeah, okay, now I can read this, is that this is, I have a phrase, you know, I'm never going to play this game again or I'm never going to watch this movie again. That usually means it's not something that I felt was enjoyable enough to warrant the usage of the time, basically. There are several games and movies and shows that sit in this category. Phantome Menace may have actually dropped out of the I'm willing to watch it again thing, because I've always had an enjoyment of the prequels, despite them being the prequels, but after watching it this time, and again, really paying attention, well, let's just say that the obvious flaws are obvious, and all the rest of the flaws kind of make it worse. But I do want to mention one thing here. It's a story I want to tell you, actually. It's a story about me when I was a few years younger, and was going out with my mum to the local movie theater to the midnight showing of the Phantome Menace. We showed up at like 8 or 9, and it was crammed. There were so many people there, so many people in costume. This was in Topeka, Kansas, by the way, which is also known as nothing ever happens there, and also it's the middle of nowhere and has nothing to do with anything. There is nothing significant about Topeka other than the historical significance of the railroad and the cattle drive. We're not going to talk about that. And yet, even in Topeka, there were droves of people. And Mom had actually purchased the tickets over 2 weeks in advance to ensure that we had midnight showings. And it was packed. Every single seat was filled. And they were showing it on multiple screens because, of course, they were! What people don't understand in the more modern era is that in 1999, Star Wars was pretty much at its height in overall popularity. After the Thrawn trilogy, which, let's be honest with ourselves, is what really began the extended universe. I know that could be debated, but it's the Doom argument all over again. Yes, there were FPSs before Doom, but Doom started the FPS craze, right? Thrawn trilogy really boomed the extended universe to such a severe extent that it grew and grew and grew and gave us many amazing books and games and works and all sorts of awesome stuff. And as it was expanding, one thing that had never happened, one thing that wasn't even conceived of for so long, was the idea that there would be another Star Wars movie. The assumption had always been that Star Wars would forevermore expand into the realm of books, games, and otherwise. There were quite a few efforts, actually, to make it into a television show, which all failed, which is ironic because later on the television show would be considered vastly superior quality to the movies, but I'm getting ahead of myself. But when that movie was announced, when it was announced that they were making Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, I cannot put into words the hype. I can say definitively that I don't think there has ever been, and has not, there was never before, and not since up until this day, more overall excitement and hype for anything in all of geek culture, across all of the massive swath that is, than for this one movie. I want to take a side note before I continue with this tale to explain that I'm not trying to make the argument that the movie didn't live up to expectations, because that's not the argument. And in fact, I've said it before, I actually hate that argument. It is possible to live up to expectations, and if I could be so blunt, if we got Revenge of the Sith that day, I think we would have just been like, yeah! Instead of, the extant response. The reason I make this point is that it was a beautifully crafted trap that could only have been sidestepped by care, time, effort, and the cohesive work of many, many talented individuals all working together earnestly and sincerely to make the best possible movie they could. That is not what Phantom Menace was. Phantom Menace, well, I'll get to that in a little bit. Let me continue my tale for now. I was actually wearing the outfit I'm wearing right now when I went to see that. This one right here, it's, I haven't grown since I was 14, so, it still fits me pretty much just as well as it ever did. And I'm kind of a geek, and so, we're all there filed into the theater. They actually were catering. This was so cool. This is such a fond memory of mine, so forgive me for sharing it with such joy, but they were catering this place. Baskin Robbins was there, and Subway, and this little Chinese place. I can't remember the name of it. It was a local joint. All three of them had brought in food, and they actually had the banquet tables and all that out there in the movie lobby, and people were chatting and sharing stories and talking about, what's going to be this, what's going to be that. We knew tidbits. For example, we knew Palpatine was in it as the Emperor, which is ironic for reasons I'm not going to go into in any of these videos. We knew that, Anakin was in it, we knew Obi-Wan was in it, we knew it was before the Clone Wars, and that was kind of it, really. I mean, there were very few details that had come out prior to the movie come out, and everyone was kibitzing and talking and chatting, and we get in there and sit down. It's like 10 o'clock. We've got like 2 hours to burn. And I know I've shared this tale before to some of you, so forgive me, but several of the fans there had decided to start recreating scenes from the movies, the movies at that point in time, up there in front, because the way this particular theater was laid out, it went back like this, and there wasn't much of a front row. There was only 2 rows there, and most of that was the handicapped. So there's this nice big space in between the front chairs and the screen. So it was effectively a small stage. So naturally, I volunteered and or possibly may have leapt out of my seat at joy at the thought of playing Palpatine. And back then, I could actually do the Palpatine voice better than I can now. I've actually kind of lost the talent to do it. I'd have to start practicing again. But back then, I witness the firepower of this fully armed and operational battle station. See, I've kind of lost it now, but back then I could do it perfectly. And so I'm just there, and we're doing the big climactic scene of Return of the Jedi, and then they did the big spiel through Empire Strikes Back, and the big duel between Luke and Vader. There was a guy in a Vader costume, and a guy in a Luke costume, of course. It was fun. And when I left that theater that night, I had a smile on my face, because I enjoyed the movie. I know what you're thinking. What? You enjoyed Phantom Menace? Yes, I did. 2 big reasons why. 3, really. Number 1, it has always been my nature to see the positive side of things and to have a positive outlook rather than a negative one. Reason 2, and this is something I've talked about a few trillion times. I don't have a term for it. I know there is not philosophical, psychological term for this, but the idea that if you're watching something, your enjoyment of that thing can and probably will be affected by the audience, which is also with you. If you're watching a totally neutral movie and the audience is just negatively impacted towards it, you are more likely to be negatively impacted towards it. And if you're watching something totally neutral and the audience is beneficial, they're like, yes, this is great, and they're enjoying it, you are more likely to enjoy it. It's one of the reasons I still enjoy going to the theaters and still enjoy going to midnight showings in general. Because, and this has been true for so long for me, the people at the midnight showings, 9 times out of 10, are the people who are there because they want to see it. They are fans. They are there to enjoy the experience. And so that audience is going to be cheering and laughing and enjoying it right alongside you. And so overall, you'll enjoy it more than you otherwise would. Make sense? Some might call that cheating, but I disagree because movies in general are, in my frank opinion, things that should be shared. They are a social experience despite the lack of interactivity with the actual medium. But I don't want to get too much into talking about movies and the medium works because I'll be saving that for my 7th video, and that's the only hint you're getting. Suffice it to say that I walked out of that theater and it was very enjoyable. I loved watching that movie. I actually went and saw it again in the theaters. Here's the thing. Phantom Menace was ruined because of 2 things, in my opinion. George Lucas and everyone else. Now, I know, that sounds like I'm making a facetious statement. Let me explain a little bit. The George problem, as I call it, is very simple. It's something that happens in fiction a few trillion times and has happened in other works I've talked about, actually. In fact, ironically, I was just talking about this with regards to Hideo Kojima. The George problem is a talented individual, and I'm sorry, I'm just going to say this blunt. George Lucas is a talented individual. I'll talk more about how and why in a moment. But a talented individual had tremendous success, let it go to his or her head, and then, and this is the key part, and this is why it's not just George's fault, everyone let him, or her, as the case may be. Everyone said yes to George. Phantom Menace is a perfect example of the kind of work that should have been a masterpiece. And all it needed was a little more care and time and attention to detail. Allow me to use an analogy that I will be using in the coming weeks when I start talking about Dragon Age 2 on the stream. Hope you'll join me. So, quiet plug here. Watch my stream. What companies like BioWare do, what designers like Roddenberry or George Lucas do, is they take a cube of clay, right? And they chop it out, and they come up with something interesting, engaging, thought-provoking, fascinating, crude, simple, ultimately not good. What then happens in the good times, like with Dragon Age Origins, like with Star Trek The Original Series or Star Trek TNG Season 3 on, like with the original trilogy and Revenge of the Sith, is other people then come in and do the detailing. They say, well, why don't we smooth this out? Why don't we add this here? Why don't we add a little bit of a carving here? Why don't we make sure that the lighting changes? Why don't we put her on a different pedestal? There's so many different tiny little details you can do to that clunk of clay. And let's be clear, they couldn't have done that if the brilliant person hadn't first come out and said, here's the idea. Because I stand firmly on my statement that the Phantom Menace was a good idea. It was. The overall concept of the movie, the thematic significance of the last days of a gasping empire, and the idea of, in this case, the Old Republic, and the idea of seeing the Jedi at their height, and the concept of following the emotional growth of an individual as he discovers who and what he is, and the nature of the dark side and the light side, and all the interesting things that are there in Phantom Menace, could have been better if it was just polished and worked and detailed. If you had taken that chunk of crude, simple art and turned it into a masterpiece. I weep for the Phantom Menace that we will never have. Because it could have been glorious. It could have been a movie rivaling the original trilogy. It could have been a movie we held up there on the same pedestal. And let's be honest, we do it. We put the original trilogy on a pedestal. I'm very curious. I haven't actually watched the original trilogy in a long time. I'm very curious to see what my opinion's going to be once I turn on the analysis mode for them. But it could have been up there too. And it was all because of his ego and everyone else's unwillingness to stand up to him. And in case you think I'm lying about this, I have 2 points of evidence to share. 3, actually. Number 1, that's how the original trilogy was made. George Lucas had to make concessions and constantly, have other people work on his script and work on his ideas and work on his setting and work on his world that he was building, and took his rough ideas and turned them into Empire Strikes Back, Return of the Jedi. Even A New Hope really is, in many ways, a masterpiece. I'm saying that now, of course, not having rewatched it. That already has happened. But he was young then, right? So, time changes people, right? Revenge of the Sith. Checkmate. I postulate to this day that Revenge of the Sith is an honestly good movie. It has flaws, let's be honest. But those flaws pale in comparison to everything it does right. And what happened with Revenge of the Sith was people were willing to stand up to George, and he let other people work in on his work. And what we got was a better created work of art, rather than a chunk of clay that's interesting, but not fully fleshed out. I'll be talking as we go through this, in my 3 pages of notes, about specific details and points on this. But this truly is, in my opinion, the greatest flaw of the entire thing. And all of that can be pulled all the way back down to George Lucas's belief that the light side is good and the dark side is bad, too. Now, I'm going to be blunt. It's his work, and he has some right to say that the light side is good and the dark side is bad. But when I say some, well, there's no easy way to say this. Ownership of a work is debatable. Is it the original creator who did it? Is it the original creators, the multitude of people who work together to make such a thing? Is it the creators and the creator and the fans? Do we have a stake in it as well? I say it's debatable because there is no correct answer here. I have only my opinion on the matter, and my opinion is clear. We have a stake in it, just like they have a stake in it, just like he has a stake in it. Star Wars is not owned by Disney. It is owned by us, and by him, and by them. So I don't think Disney or Lucas or anyone else, individual or entity or group, has the power to say, this is true and this is not. Just my personal opinion on the matter. It is also worth noting that this is specific to the case. For example, if you were to look at Harry Potter, that is something that has basically been crafted by one individual with some help, and so, for the most part, she does have greater clemency in saying, this is true, this is not, within her setting. But George Lucas didn't make Star Wars. He started Star Wars, and then many other people helped make it with him. And Star Wars is an extremely well-established thing that's been around since the 70s. Think about that for a moment. Think about... Well, I don't want to tell that story. We'll save that for when we get to the original trilogy. Suffice it to say, his belief that the light side is good and dark side is bad is so self-apparent in the construction of this movie. Because all the things that I'm going to talk about with regards to reading into it, all the things that had been confirmed by the books around this era, the prequel era, the Clone Wars era, basically, all confirm what I'm going to analyze and in-depth look at with regards to this movie, with regards to the setting primarily and the lore and history thereof. But all of that was unintentional. And I'll talk about that more in a moment. I'm sorry, I'm kind of getting off. I'm literally on my 3rd note here on the first page. Let's go and talk about the special effects, because way too much has been talked about the special effects of the prequels. I'm going to go ahead and be blunt. Yes, they overused CGI. There, I said it. You happy? Now I'm going to kind of completely contradict myself. For those of you who have actually read in on the makings of the Phantom Menace particular, I don't know the other, or rather I don't know Attack of the Clones that well, but I do know a great deal about the making of the Phantom Menace, and they did rely on CGI, arguably too much. I'll talk about that in a moment. But what they did not do was lean on CGI to the point of excessiveness. It was a difference in their mentality and their approach, not the CGI itself that was the problem. Let me explain what I mean a little bit. One of the things that most people don't like to talk about, and I've actually mentioned this on my stream several times, is that Phantom Menace, and all 3 of the prequels really, actually used traditional effects, which I'm a huge fan of personally, a lot. Way more than most people tend to think. A lot of set design, a lot of creative use of what they had available. I mean, my favorite example I like to give of this is actually the stands for the big Boon to Eve race, the pod race, right, on Tatooine. Those aren't CGI. They are touched up by CGI, but that is okay. Because in my opinion, that is one of the two best uses of CGI. The first best use is obviously doing stuff you can't do with regular effects, or is space battles or big flashy, oh my god, things like that. Yeah, sure, okay. But in my opinion, the best use of CGI is to touch up existing effects to make them more polished, more detailed, shine. You follow? And forgive me for flaunting my very minimal experience in movie making, television, etc., and video editing and graphics design. The more you have to start with, the better the end product is going to result in, like 9 times out of 10, possibly even more than that. Or to explain what I mean a bit better, the attitude of, oh, we'll just fix it in post is, forgive me for being blunt, wrong. The more you have to rely on post-processing, post-production, the special effects, the editing, the design, the worse your net product is going to look. The better you can get, if you can get that take just perfect and don't have to edit together 3 or 4 takes, if you can get that scene just right, if you can get the design set up just so, then what you will have is a better finished product, because then the special effects have more of a bedrock, more of a grounding to build upon. Because special effects in general, but especially when it comes to CGI, are best suited to accent, not to be the focus of a scene, not to replace a scene, but to help add to a scene. Let me give you a direct example of what I'm talking about. In the movie, I'm assuming many of you have seen Pirates of the Caribbean 2 and or 3. 2 is the one I'm going to use specifically because I know more people like that one, but the point is made regardless. Bill Nighy, I'm not sure if that's how you pronounce his name, but that's how I pronounce it, is an awesome actor, and he's someone I love. He's also a very professional actor, and it shows by the way he played Davy Jones. Now, here's the thing that they did absolutely right. They actually had Bill Nighy there on the set. They had him in the suit, and he looks ridiculous. If you've ever seen him in the gray suit with all the little lights and diodes, he looks, frankly, silly. And it's a testament to the art and craft of acting that you have to act at someone who's in a gimp suit and looks retarded as if they were a real person. But Bill Nighy, showing that professionalism and that competency as an actor I just mentioned, he struts up there and he acts like Davy Jones in every single way. His mannerisms, his speech, the way he does those little head jerks, the way he moves. He actually had a thing on his leg to make it so he would actually walk as if with the stunt. They could have fixed that in editing. They could have CGI'd his leg out, but they didn't. So his overall movements look more realistic, which means when they put the shell of Davy Jones on him, Davy Jones looks more realistic because it is modeled after an actual human who is actually moving. Huh? They bothered to put the makeup on his eyes and around his mouth and in certain key points around his face, specifically so that his facial expressions could then be accented and augmented by the basically the CGI mask of Davy Jones, rather than them having to come up with facial expressions on their own. You see where I'm going with this? This is a good example of this, of what I'm talking about. But it's true just in film in general, especially in film, but this also applies to television. Now, and actually this applies to video games too. Motion captures are a great example of how you can get a good performance, relatively speaking, out of a character who is entirely effectively CGI, because video games aren't, there's no people there. But you do good motion capture, you do people, and the more motion capturing you do, the more effective design you do with the face and how much you capture of their expressions and their acting, the better performance you're going to get. And again, Metal Gear Solid actually did that pretty damn well, all things considered. Now, let's talk about what Phantome Menace did. If you have not seen, forgive me for not knowing his name, but I forget the name of the gentleman who played Jar Jar Binks. I'm not talking about his voice. I'm talking about the guy who was in the dumb suit, which was obviously fake and crafted only to be there as a stunt. They could have literally replaced him with a stick, and it would have had the same relative difference. He had this dumb little, incredibly basic and poorly designed Jar Jar looking head on, an incredibly basic design for his hands, and it was literally just there as a guideline so the CGI could be plastered on top of that. And the effects are amazingly apparent, because he does not move like a person, because he does not look any form realistic, because it's incredibly obvious that people are talking with CGI. Now, yes, people are talking with CGI when it comes to Davy Jones, but all of the effort that was made to make the original piece, the take, as good as possible, makes it so that you can move past that and believe that they're actually talking to Davy Jones rather than a cluster of CGI. By contrast, I never reached that point, at least in this movie, with Jar Jar. And it's so apparent, too, because they never kept consistency with his positioning. See, I mentioned he had that head thing. That's because Jar Jar is taller than a normal human, so that people had something to look at when they looked at it. Okay, that's good. But the actors didn't actually know what to look at on the mask. And it's obvious when you watch the movie, if you really pay attention. Sometimes the actors are looking just above Jar Jar's head, sometimes they're looking like right about here, sometimes they're looking like right about there, because they weren't 100% sure what to look at on the mask, which wasn't actually even moving all the time where the head was moving. You know? It all felt, forgive me, fake. Now that is one of the risks you run when you do something like have a character who is effectively entirely CGI. But as I feel like I've just demonstrated, you can do that properly if you take the care and time and effort and talented individuals, etc., to work on it. I suppose this is always as good a time as ever to talk about the other problem. Trying to think how best to put this. I'm going to go ahead and mention this early, because this is a point that is significant throughout the entire piece. I mentioned George Lucas's light versus dark thing that I disagree with completely. One of the reasons I mentioned that is Phantom Menace doesn't look like a Star Wars movie. And if you know what I'm talking about, you're probably just like nodding your head over there, because it doesn't feel like a Star Wars movie either, does it? Except for a few key points. But what I mean by that is the aesthetic of Star Wars has always been very particular. It was an aesthetic born of happenstance, of accident, of making do with what they had, right? But two big problems came together in Phantom Menace to ensure that it did not have that same aesthetic. Number one, George Lucas's thing. I'm going to talk about this first. The idea that, there's no easy way to put this, based on the construction of Phantom Menace, and again, if we take Phantom Menace by itself, the writing, the style of the sets, the style of the production, it's obvious he is demonstrating a galaxy that is actually doing really awesome. It's basically a paradise. He is trying to demonstrate that the Old Republic was awesome, and it was only started going downhill when Palpatine, aka the Dark Side, started interfering with it. And it's apparent everywhere. Watch the movie again sometime, if you dare, and you'll see what I mean. Memory alone should probably do it. Star Wars always feels lived in, right? It always feels not quite pristine, but not quite grimy or dirty. It's just used. It looks like a setting that always has this particular aesthetic sense of being something that's used, something that's worn in, something that's worn out. You know, a pair of leather shoes that have been worn a few hundred times. And that adds to the appeal of Star Wars because it makes Star Wars feel more real than it otherwise would. By contrast, Phantom Menace feels pristine. It's glimmering, it's shining. Everything is done to the nth degree to make everything as nice and neat and light as possible. Even on Tatooine, and this is where it really came together for me. I mean, obviously Naboo looks wonderful. That is basically a paradise planet. And obviously Coruscant, well, we'll talk about that when we get to Coruscant. But Tatooine looked way too nice, way too neat, and way too clean. And it's obvious that was being done on purpose to highlight that this is the world before the dark side. This is the world that is, the setting that is better. Now again, this isn't actually true when taking everything into account, because the extended works and the later movies contradict this by showing that actually the Old Republic was way on the downturn and was basically in the worst stages of its corruption at this point in time. But that's George Lucas's biggest problem in a nutshell as a writer. And I sympathize with him on this. George Lucas is a simple writer. He does not know, he knows how to take an interesting idea, but he does not know how to explore it. He does not know how to flesh it out into something complicated or extravagant or otherwise simply realistic, basically, something that has depth to it. And so he portrays a setting that is good because the light side is there, and soon it will be bad because the dark side will be better. It's very simple. I'll be talking about that throughout as well. But the other problem, and again, it's not just George's fault, the other problem is the lack of limitations. Now, I know that sounds weird, but I've talked about this idea before, especially speaking as someone who has worked with creative writing and taught creative writing so many times at this point. Hell, I've even done it on my stream. I've said before and I've said again, one of the greatest creative tools any writer can be given is to be limited. Because when you are limited, you are forced to become creative in order to overcome those limitations, in order to do the story you want to do. Now, that also, if you want to be blunt, can separate good writers from bad writers, or indeed people who have the ability to write and people who don't, because a lot of people when faced with limitations cannot overcome them. But what was shown by the original people who worked on Star Wars, and this includes not just the CGI effects, but the writing staff and the overall production department, Star Wars, even the original trilogy, even Empire and Return, which both had a significant amount of financial backing and help to them, thanks to the success of A New Hope, but most especially in A New Hope, all of that stuff was made because they were just barely scraping by. They had nothing. They had no backing, no history, no development. Science fiction on the movies was kind of a new concept at that point in time. It was something that was not really seen as a viability. But credit to George Lucas, he pushed for it, and he made a lot of concessions, he made a lot of right calls too, and he brought in a lot of people who were just as passionate about getting a good, old-fashioned, hero's journey, Seven Samurai, whatever you want to call it, story up there on the big screen, as he was. And so they were limited at every step of production and acting and writing and everything, and they worked through it. They worked around it, and what we got was Star Wars. Phantom Menace had none of those limitations. The only thing you could even conceivably, and this is pulling it technically, say was a limitation for Phantom Menace, was the fact that it had the expectation of what I mentioned earlier, the greatest expectation in geek culture history, arguably. It was a new Star Wars movie. But that's not a limitation. If anything, that's just a stress inducer. They had a gabrillion money. I mean, the budget was not an issue. Time was not an issue. There was no one saying, we have to have this movie out by this point in time. They controlled that. But unfortunately, Phantom Menace showed very clearly why limitations on creativity can be a good thing. Because a lot of writers can take a piece of paper that has, write a story about blah on it, include these elements and include these points, and make a good story out of that. Very few writers can sit down with a completely blank sheet of paper and make a good story out of that. And so I do feel like the overall design and production of this movie went overboard in a lot of ways. The CGI being the obvious one, but overall design and the production of the script and a lot of scenes with the directing and the acting are all self-evident of this point. They just were going wild with it. And technically that's not even necessarily a bad thing. As I've argued before and will argue again, we got some good things out of Phantom Menace. Because Phantom Menace was their trial, okay, we need to get into the swing of things and figure out our footing again thing, we did get some good things out of that. Revenge of the Sith being an obvious one. The Clone Wars television show was another good one. The Clone Wars cartoon is actually a pretty good example of this too. We wouldn't have had those if they hadn't started badly and fleshed it out. But at the same, well, I mean, that's actually not a lie. My point is, this is a lemonade out of lemon situation. They could have made Phantom Menace better, but I'm getting way off topic. So, God, I have so many things to talk about. I think we're done with all our overall things to talk about that affect the entire movie, and then we'll just kind of go down the list as we get to point by point, as I was taking notes as the movie went. I do want to mention a couple other things. The racism of the movie. Now, I'm not going to be discussing that as a whole or on point, because Well, because the obvious reason. I have a long-standing rule in my existence, never mind my show, of not discussing quote-unquote hot topics. But one thing I want to point out is I don't really see it, personally. I don't really see the so-called racism in this setting. Given the wide variety of people we see playing different races and different people, given the fact that there are certain, even the Nemoidians have a degree of variance to them and are very fleshed out in the extended universe, and the Gungans as a whole also are not really indicative of that so-called stereotype that Jar Jar himself is. Jar Jar adheres to the so-called stereotype, but none of the other Gungans do. And there's, again, some complexity and depth to their culture, so I don't see it, personally. I could also point out that there's quite a few people of quite a few nationalities who played quite a few roles in this movie. So, really don't see it. That's just my take on it. But I'm not just not discussing it because I don't think it, because I don't discuss that sort of things. I don't think it's there. One more thing, real quick. I like to play a game. I know, weird, right? Our Shanghai likes to play games. What I mean by this is I do this with my friends and in many cases with my viewers. Intellectual games. I don't really have a proper term for them. It's things that I find intellectually stimulating. I actually enjoy playing these games. The who would you be in a setting, or who would be you? In other words, taking a setting and finding a character that most fits a person's personality with regards to, true honesty, no attempts at flattery or insult or jokery here. The idea of the tiers, which I've talked about a few trillion times, which is probably because it's the most interesting of these games to me. Based on tier 3, which setting would you put yourself in, or what tier would you have to be put into this setting, that kind of a thing, right? But another one I've played, and again, I've done this on the stream, is take a work that is not necessarily great. It can be good, bad, terrible, awful, or just neutral, and try to make the most beneficial and positive impact on it possible with as few changes to the work as possible, okay? The goal is always to try and get it down to just one change, and sometimes you can't just do one change. There's too many things that need changing. But, try and get it down to as few changes as possible to make it overall, in your opinion, a great work. Now, having rewatched Phantom Menace, I've said this before in my streams, so it's no surprise. I've often said I could make Phantom Menace a good movie with one change. But if I was to try and make Phantom Menace into a great movie, especially on reviewing, I would take more than one change to do that. But I'm going to go and share the one change with you. Make Anakin a teenager. I'll be discussing this more in-depth as we go through here. But remove the kiddie antics, which are unnecessary. Remove the fact that he doesn't get any real character growth other than one scene, maybe two, depending on how you define it, and actually flesh out Anakin Skywalker as our character. Because remember, these are the prequel trilogy. The story so many of us wanted to see was the story of Anakin Skywalker, not Darth Vader. Anakin Skywalker. We wanted to see the Clone Wars. I'll talk about that more in a bit in the next video. We wanted to see Obi-Wan as Prime. We wanted to see the Jedi in the old days. We wanted to see the Old Republic on its final legs. We wanted to see all these things. But we don't see Anakin Skywalker in this movie, again, except for a few crucial scenes. We see a kid who will someday become Anakin Skywalker, who will someday become Darth Vader. It's an unnecessary step, and it doesn't make full logical sense given the way that the movies as a trilogy are structured. Bump him up to teenager, flesh out all the beginnings of his character arc here in the first movie, and I think that change by itself would be a phenomenal, huge plus to this movie. Just my opinion. Now let's start going down the list here. I'm sorry, actually, apparently I have one more thing talking about the movie as a whole. There are a surprising number of good actors in this work. Terrence Stamp and Ian McDiarmid and not Liam O'Brien, I suddenly can't think of the guy who played Qui-Gon, the guy who played Obi-Wan. I suddenly can't think of actors' names, but there's a surprising, and for God's sake, Samuel L. Jackson's this movie. And make fun, but he's actually a good actor, so, And they had, for God's sakes, they had, what's his name? Hang on. I wrote it down here. Brian Blessed. They had Brian Blessed in this movie, for God's sakes. It's not like they didn't have talent available to go around. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The intro is fascinating because it's actually rather well demonstrated, in my opinion. It's probably one of the few things where you take that simple idea and it's good. Now, they should have extrapolated on this, but it was still good. Let me explain what I mean. The intro shows the Jedi Knights at their height. Normally when you do a movie, you want the protagonist to face some danger and difficulty and barely succeed. But you actively don't want to do this in this specific case, because what we want to see is the Jedi back when they were the Jedi Knights, the Jedi Order. We want to see what they were capable of, so that we can then understand how significant it was and watch the Jedi Order as a whole fall apart and the Knights go downhill in terms of competency and capacity. But in order to do that, we need to see them at their greatest right at the beginning. And so Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon win at every turn. Everyone that is involved in them is basically powerless before them, and the absolute best they can manage is to pull them into a draw, which still ends up working in their disadvantage overall. And that's actually good. That's actually really well done, I think, and proper. I have a point here, which I may talk about for a while, so forgive me. I have no idea how long this video is going to be. I have so many things to talk about. The complacency of the Republic worlds, again, thinking the fleshed-out view, taking the extended universe into consideration, and Episode 2 and 3. The complacency of the Republic and the I don't want to call it corruption so much as rot. The stagnation and rot that is the Old Republic is very on display in this movie, which is funny because it was kind of done by accident, as I already mentioned. Think about this for a moment. The Old Republic basically didn't have a military. Not really. This is actually demonstrated many times, in not just in the movies, but in the extended universe. The idea that they had a military which was basically little better than a well-dressed police force, which was used almost exclusively as a political tool by various, political powers, sometimes on a planet-level basis. It was kind of ridiculous, actually. But this is shown actually rather brilliantly in this movie. I know, weird, right? Especially since it was done by accident. The very existence of a droid army speaks to two things. One, the culture of the Neimoidians. I'll get to that later, much later. I think it's like on page 3. But two, the overall political situation, the climate, and the society and culture that is existent at this point in time in galactic history. In other words, a droid army is something that is basically weak. This has been true throughout Star Wars history, actually, but never basically is not true. The concept of a droid army is that they can be manufactured much quicker than a human can, and they are much more expendable, and they can be cheaper depending on how you produce them. So it's literally a Zerg mentality, except it isn't. But it just swarm, go. We have reserves in a nutshell, right? That type of force will unerringly pale in comparison to a real military force, unless certain exceptions are met. I'll talk about that more when we get to the Clone Wars stuff, which is not now. But my reason for pointing this out is a droid army that is feared, a droid army that has a reputation and respect, that can only exist in a society that doesn't have real military power. You understand? It shows just how impotent the Old Republic really was. Yes, we have words, and we have money, and we have more words, and we have debates and politics and social understandings and trade agreements, but we lack the power, the real, or as I like to call it, personal power, to actually back that up. And so the Trade Federation, with their, let's be honest, kind of pathetic army, is actually a strong force at this point in time in the setting because of just how weak everyone and everything else is. The other thing that's indicative about this, though, granted, Naboo is not an ideal perspective, but the conquest of Naboo very much highlights everything I'm talking about with regards to the Old Republic and its state of affairs at this point in history. Number one, Naboo is conquered basically in about a day. 1 day to conquer a planet with a pathetic army. Now, granted, Naboo did not have an army, but the constant approach that everyone is behaving with and regarding the army is, well, they can't do this. And it's so funny. They are so completely powerless to actually do anything about it. It's almost hysterical how their minds can't seem to wrap themselves around the fact that they are being militarily threatened. And that's the key point right there. Again, granted, this is Naboo, but I feel like this is indicative of the Old Republic as a whole. The idea that a planet could be militarily conquered and that planet's response would be, huh? You can't do that. It's not legal. And that's actually ironically mirrored in the Nemoidians and the Trade Federation themselves, because the one thing they constantly were working towards is to make their invasion legal. They were actually afraid of what would happen if their invasion was not legally ratified. And the irony is they themselves have that same mentality that the Conquered did. That it has to be legalized. It has to be legitimate. Those words, those debates, those policies have power, right? Even the Trade Federation, who has an army and a fleet, doesn't even realize the total impotence of the Republic in this era. Even the force that has real power on such a minuscule scale that the Trade Federation does is still a slave to that same mentality. That mentality of, oh, well, let's discuss it in a committee, and then we'll make sure that the laws support our existence here so we can expand our trade, blah, 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 blah. Now, I could talk more about that, but I'll save that for a little bit more for later. My very next note is, it's actually like 5 notes. The first note is, I don't know if you can see this, but it's kind of outlined in a box here. It says, "Leave Jar Jar." I think that summarizes everything, but that's actually my 5th note of the 5. The first note is just Jar Jar versus C-3PO. I challenged myself to really look at this. Some people have postulated that we only liked the old Star Wars because of nostalgia. Now, I've said it before, and I'll say it a few trillion more times until I manage to hammer the point into people's head. No, we don't like things just because of nostalgia, thank you. We like them because we like them. And it's also worth noting that nostalgia is not necessarily a bad thing within reason, just like everything is not necessarily a bad thing within reason, or properly applied. But I challenged myself when looking at this to look at this movie and say, okay, I'm going to compare and contrast C-3PO, who was the comic relief of the original trilogy, but most specifically in A New Hope, limiting it to A New Hope, the movie that George had the most influence on, and then Jar Jar in Phantom Menace, the movie George had the most influence on, right? After some careful thought on the matter, I decided that Jar Jar Binks is very broad, childish humor. And that's basically it. He is very slapstick. He is someone you're supposed to point and laugh at. He is someone who does silly, stupid things that are silly and stupid and therefore are supposed to be funny. It's obvious by my tone I don't find those things funny. But then I looked at C-3PO, and you could levy the same arguments at him, but at the same time you actually can't. C-3PO is surprisingly complex in his humor, because C-3PO is 2 very important things. Number 1, he is the only sane man. Those of you who've done anything with writing or creative design probably know exactly what I'm talking about, but to explain it in brief, imagine a setting which everyone just kind of accepts everything as weird, and they're all just a little bit crazy and willing to do things that a normal, plain, ordinary human would look at and go, you're crazy. C-3PO is that person in Star Wars. To explain what I mean a little bit, we, as purveyors of fiction, can look at a setting and say, oh, well, they're just stupid. But it's too easy, and I've talked about this before, it's too easy to forget that a normal, ordinary, everyday person put into those circumstances is not going to behave like the protagonists do, or even like the antagonists do. Most people just want to live their ordinary lives and go about their jobs and do their business. And by the way, there's no judgment here. There's nothing wrong with that. But that's what an ordinary perspective is. You drag a totally ordinary person into a galactic war with the Force on one side and Death Stars and Star Destroyers on the other, and they're going to be flipping out half the time and constantly talking and trying to make these other people see the light of how crazy the things they're going to do. And it sounds awfully familiar now that I'm explaining it like that, doesn't it? Think about how often C-3PO portrayed these perspectives as stupid, beyond him, ridiculous. Why would anyone want to go on an adventure? That's terrible. So there's a sophistication to C-3PO built into the very core concept of his character that is lacking in Jar Jar. But that brings me to my next point. C-3PO presents a bit of a schadenfreude, forgive me for pronouncing that wrong, in his humor. For example, Jar Jar is someone who is slapstick, but there's a difference between slapstick and something bad happened to him, and therefore we're supposed to find that funny. Now, I'm not actually into Schadenfreude. Schadenfreude? I have no idea how to say it. I'm not good with German. I never have been. Apologies. For those who don't know what the term is, it means to find positive in someone else's negative, to put it as bluntly as possible. Someone trips on the street and you laugh at them. That's Schadenfreude, in a nutshell. C-3PO has several bad things that happen to him. He's the brunt and the blunt end of a lot of jokes and a lot of slapstick and a lot of other issues that happen to him. But the difference is Jar Jar just steps in poo and is like, oh no. C-3PO, I think I'll use my favorite example here, loses his head, quite literally, and is blown to pieces by the Sand People, right? My point is, the approach to Jar, and this is very indicative of what I was talking about earlier with the simplicity. The approach to Jar Jar, it doesn't leave the first step. Something bad happens. Laugh. C-3PO is always something bad happens, and then he moans or laments it, or he tries to be helped by his others, and this is the most crucial part, grows. I thought about this, because C-3PO is someone that I think, if you asked me, and I'm sure a lot of you, when I first compared C-3PO to Jar Jar, wanted to smack me for comparing Jar Jar to C-3PO, who's awesome. Here's the thing. 3PO grows as a character. He evolves, he adapts, he gains nuances. We see the real 3PO whenever the chips are down. And here's the most beautiful part of all. That's still true in A New Hope. It's not this is one of the very few things where I don't have to say because of the extended universe or because of Empire and Return where they fleshed out everything. No. Even in A New Hope, 3PO grew as a character. And I mean, there's actually several examples of this, but probably my two favorites. One's obvious and one's not. The obvious one is his genuine concern he shows for R2-D2 right before the Battle of Yavin and right after the Battle of Yavin, actually. His approach and his personality there shows that he actually has layers to him, has depth to him, isn't just an idiot. Contrast that with the big battle, climactic battle that happened on Naboo, where Jar Jar literally slapsticks his way around, actually killing people kind of randomly, and then surrenders immediately when a gun is pointed at his face. No depth, no growth, no understanding, no nothing. He is the exact same character he entered the movie as. In the interest of fairness, I kind of like that scene where he's randomly killing droids just by happenstance, because that's some well-designed comedy in its structure, I should say. But it's still completely simple, and again, total lack of character growth. By the way, the second example, the more subtle example of 3PO actually growing as a character, after Obi-Wan dies. Spoiler alert. After Obi-Wan dies, 3PO doesn't say anything. He does not say one word. He is just quietly consoling. That moment, how many of you thought about this? I'm genuinely curious. That moment shows depth to 3PO right there. That he has that despite all his supposed naivety and innocence and stupidity, he understands and can comprehend that kind of loss. That he also feels for it. That he also cares about what happened. That shows 3PO as a person, not just a ball of goop that smacks into someone and you're supposed to laugh at that. I suppose I'll mention it here, even though I will mention it also in my Episode 2 video. It is worth noting that despite the many flaws George Lucas has, one true thing is that when he decides to listen to other people, or when other people are willing to stand up to him, George Lucas is willing to swallow his ego and listen to other people. For those of you who have not seen all the behind-the-scenes stuff, Lucas was basically someone who really wanted the Jar Jar character. In his own words, he wanted someone light and funny. That's why he has no character growth. That's why he has no character development. He was intended to be something that uplifts the mood of the movie, and that's it. No complexity, no depth, very simple, very George. But when people told him he's not well received, he's not going to work, we have nothing to work with, we want to basically abandon him, Jar Jar was dialed down to the point of basically being a cameo and nothing else in Episodes 2 and 3. Even though he had a significant role in the overall setting, quote-unquote, and could have been made a major character, he wasn't. So I will give credit where credit is due here. I do like the overall portrayal of Obi-Wan at most points in this movie. In many ways, and I owe this mostly to the performance of the actor, because this will be much, much more apparent later on when the writing and directing is on par. We see in him the same dry wit and the same kind of slightly, taking the universe with a grin personality that Obi-Wan always kind of had. And yet we see it minus all the things that made the Obi-Wan we knew that character. He doesn't have the pain yet. He doesn't have the experience yet. He doesn't have the wisdom born of that pain and experience. Obi-Wan's just a kid, but he still has that same core personality underneath. That's a nice touch, and I wanted to comment on that. I also want to comment on something here. The set design throughout this movie is actually amazing. I know I commented on it being too clean, but that's a matter of aesthetics and something that could be touched up and changed without much issue. The actual overall architectural design of the Gungan city, whose name I can't remember and I forgot to write down. The design of Tatooine, the design of Naboo, the big Italian arches and whatnot, and of course the design of Coruscant itself, which, don't forget, this is basically our second real peek at Coruscant ever. I know it was in a few of the comics, and it's been written and described on paper several times, but as far as actually seeing Coruscant, all we saw prior to this was one brief snippet in the special editions. This was awesome, and I actually really like the design of Coruscant, but I'll talk more about Coruscant later. I just wanted to give praise where praise is definitely due, because the people who world-built, the art designers and the people who made the overall design and style, which was then put into CGI and actual sets for the various locales in this movie, did a great job, and they definitely deserve props there. Brian Blessed is interesting because Brian Blessed actually manages to add a bit of dimension to Boss Nass, or Rugor Nass if you prefer, that otherwise probably wouldn't have been there. He doesn't just say his lines like he's reading. He says them like he's a little bit bitter. Not super bitter. He is not like, oh, get off my lawn. He's not the old cranky, cantankerous old man kind of perspective. Instead, he portrays someone who is tired. Someone who's tired of having to deal with things the way he is. Someone who's tired of the fact that he feels like he's constantly being looked down upon, that his best efforts and the best efforts of his people still amount to nothing compared to the people up above. One of the things that was actually really well done from Phantom Menace that was only actually fleshed out in the books is the reunification of the Gungans and the Naboo, which is actually awesome and well fleshed out, and I hope you'll think about that on several points in the future. But the idea that these two species would then start coexisting as equals from this point on is awesome. The fact that it took these events to make that happen is also indicative of that Old Republic personality, though, and perspective. The fact that it was seen as completely normal for the Naboo to just kind of do their own thing and leave the Gungans to be, and to not really treat them as equals, and vice versa as a result of that. But one other thing I want to mention, though, is that I freely admit I didn't actually know that was Brian Blessed at first, even though I've been a fan of his work for many, many years. And it was fascinating to see the way he portrays that character, because most of the time Brian Blessed is best known for being way over the top. But the way he portrays Rugor Nass, actually shows the level of what he can do with his voice. Certainly he's bombastic, certainly he does that, but you can tell that that is just a mask for that bitterness and that quiet tiredness I mentioned before. And I honestly think almost all of that is due to Brian Blessed's acting and the voice direction, which was actually pretty well done with that regard, so definite props there. Now we get to that point which is outlined and emphasized. Leave Jar Jar. I've mentioned before, a few minutes ago actually, that I would change it so that Anakin was a teenager. The second change I would make is leaving Jar Jar. Don't remove him from the picture entirely. The third change would be making Jar Jar, not irritating. But, here's the thing. I guarantee you, most people would think of him as little more than that irritating character who they only really remember when they rewatch the movie if Jar Jar had only served as a seam to connect the Jedi landing on the planet to the undersea city. Once that seam is connected, he serves no narrative purpose whatsoever. Indeed, I've already told you what Jar Jar's purpose is, to add lightheartedness to the overall movie with simplicity and with no complications. And that's it. Now, there are other ways to accomplish that rather than having this idiot bumbling around the entire time. So don't make it so he's in trouble. Don't make it so he was banished. Just make him a Gungan that they encounter in the woods, and he helped them get to safety in the city, and then they talk to Boss Nass, who's awesome, and then they leave. That's it. Now, actually, Jar Jar should actually have a purpose later on, but I'll talk about that much later. But my point is, I think that move by itself would have gotten rid of a lot of the problems in this movie. And now I'm going to explain one of the reasons why. In addition to the slapstick, Jar Jar's lines have a tendency to make no sense. It's funny because I only really notice this kind of thing when my brain is in analyze mode, because I've played Japanese games for so long. Let me explain. Japanese does not translate well to English. It really doesn't. And I actually know a lot about that, obviously being a huge fan of Japanese culture and Japanese media, video games, etc. So, a thing that I have encountered a lot, and indeed, even up until more recent years, is the fact that you'll get a line in a game that doesn't actually make sense. Like, if you actually said that line out loud in that scene, it would just be like a, huh? Because it doesn't fit anything, it doesn't work with anything, it doesn't add to anything, and it literally makes no logical sense, even when taken on its own. Now, I've learned to kind of mentally step over those hurdles because translation issues. But this was a movie made by someone who speaks English, writes English, and talks English. And is English. So, the thing is, I never even realized I was doing it until I did this rewatching. I've been mentally skipping over a lot of Jar Jar's lines because they make no sense. Really, watch this movie sometime. Listen to the one-liners he has. They're there. I mean, obviously some of them are just, this is very, very bad. But most of them literally make no logical sense. They have nothing to do with what's happening. They don't add anything to the scene. They're not cohesive. Why? And I find myself wondering about that significantly because I don't actually have I don't have the actual answer here. The only thing I could speculate is that it was an attempt to make him feel more alien, and yet the other Gungans speak perfectly fine and legitimately and understandably. It's, again, exclusive just to Jar Jar. And I don't think speaking random gibberish applies under humor either, so I really have no idea why Jar Jar does that. I'm going to use this to segue into something else. I have a note here called Rushed Lines, which is part of that. See, there's actually a lot of scenes in this movie which are rocks in my shoe. For those of you who have not heard me make this analogy, because I've actually made this point several times recently, and will again when I do the Dragon Age stream soon. The analogy is, let's say you're going on a walk, and you're enjoying the walk, and there's plenty of things that you enjoy about the walk, but there's a rock in your shoe, and for the sake of the analogy, you cannot remove it. It's not a big thing. It's just a little rock. It just gives you a little bit of a pain, just a tiny little poke every time you step on that foot. But that's the point. Something that's small, something that's minor, but is consistent, is going to grow into something much, much more irritating. It may just be a tiny little poke. It just may be a tiny little irritant. But over time, you will hate that irritant. You will grow to think of it as much worse than it is. It will get to the point, if left to fester long enough, that you will actively stop enjoying all the other aspects of that walk because all you can focus on is how irritating it is that you're constantly getting poked in the foot. Because it's constant. The little things over time add up. You follow? I've talked about this many times before. It's one of the reasons why the gameplay aspect of video games is so important. A fantastic game that has bad gameplay is going to be a rock in your shoe. And you're going to have to deal with that rock and try to get past that rock, either with cheat codes, which I know several players do, and I do not have judgment or elitism about, or, and I do that for the lore runs as well, or just by kind of mentally trying to manage it and trying to block the rock from your perspective of that game, right? Jar Jar and a lot of the scenes in this movie are the rock for me. That's one of the reasons I think leaving him would overall improve the enjoyment of the movie as a whole. But it's not just limited to Jar Jar, because there's a lot of tiny little scenes that feel a little bit rushed and a little bit wrong. And it all goes back to what I talked about earlier. A lot of scenes exist purely to get from point A to point B, are not fully fleshed out, are not fully designed. Nobody went back and edited that script to make those lines and make those scenes make just a little bit more sense and to polish it and really make the details better. Instead, it feels like I'm constantly being poked in the back of my head. This is the other way I've done this analogy. For those of you not aware, imagine you're sitting and you're like enjoying a good movie, right? It's a movie you love, but every like 10 seconds, someone just starts poking the back of your head. There's nothing you can do about it. It's just you feel this poke in the back of your head. About half an hour of this happening, you're just gonna be like, oh my god, you know. That's exactly what it was for this. There's so many lines that are just okay. And there's one other problem, and this is much, much more apparent in Episode 2. And there's no good way to put this. George Lucas is not a good people director. For those who don't know what I mean, it's hard. Okay. Bleh. I'm going to go ahead and talk about directing here, because I might as well. Yeah, I don't have a time limit. Oh, I can do whatever I want! What? Sorry, I gave into the dark side of ruminations there for a second. Or did I? Anyways, directors tend to get the most blame and the most credit for movies. That is understandable. The way I like to put it is a director is personally responsible for about 5% of the production of a movie. Now you're probably looking at me like, huh? But I know a lot of you are probably nodding your heads, because my point is, no one else in the hundreds of people who make a movie has that much individual effect on the entire movie. You know, the next closest would probably be the actors as a whole, who have maybe like 1 or 2%. Because that's what a movie is. It's 100 of people all working together to collaborate on this work. But a director has the most, the director has the majority, basically, of influence on a work, okay? Now, directors also have different styles and different approaches to how they direct things. A director also can do things with regards to editing depending on the director. Some directors actually avoid directing after the cameras have turned off, basically. Some people make a point to get involved in the editing process and make sure that they're still doing things properly. It depends on the director. George Lucas is actually a pretty good director when it comes to structure of scenes, and when it comes to landscapes, and this is important, when it comes to big battles and to dramatic events. He is genuinely good at that sort of thing. One of the few points in this entire movie that I had a comment that was basically just good directing, and I'll talk about this later, is the big battle, the Battle of Naboo. But Lucas is not very good as a people director. The way we got all those big, awesome, personalized scenes in the original trilogy was the other people who were also directing, because some people tend to forget that George was not the only director of the original trilogy. And so, with that absence, a lot of the scenes that should have been personal and individual and, helped to flesh out characters and is just 2 characters talking, or 5 characters talking, or whatever, don't really work. There's one exception to that in Phantome Menace. I'll mention that when we get to it later. But overall, I feel like that contributes to this overall problem of someone poking me in the back of the head as I'm watching Phantome Menace. It also probably helps explain some of the schizophrenia of the thing. It's like, this is good, this is bad, whatever. Another interesting point I want to make here is the manufactured tension this movie goes for. Which is, again, weird, because it has some genuine tension later, but I'll get to that later. They're going through in this little ship, this little bongo, I believe is what they called it, and going through the planet's core, which people have bent over backwards to explain how you can go through a planet's core. It is possible, thanks to certain application of very specific physics, if you're curious. But the point being... Yeah, geophysics. The point being that the whole scene doesn't make any sense at all. And this is indicative of George not having someone to polish his script. Think about this logically. The Jedi, 2 Jedi come down on landing craft. Okay. They land on the other side of Naboo from where the actual invasion is supposed to happen. Okay. And then they have to take a shortcut through the planet's core in order to get there basically at about the same point the troops do. None of that really makes logical sense. It can be explained, but it's the kind of thing that just kind of makes you go, huh? When you think about it. The whole scene of them going through the core... I mean, my point is this, though. This was all constructed so that they could land by the swamps and go through the planet's core. That was the purpose. And thus, the story services the scenes, not the 2 meshing one with another to make an overall better piece, which is, again, indicative of George Lucas's writing style. I could do an essay on his writing style. It's actually really apparent. I could probably teach him lessons on writing. Not that I'd want to do that. But the point here being... What's the point of that scene, really? Does it service the plot in any way? It hurls from point A to point B, but that isn't actually serviceable of the plot, so no. Does it flesh out the characters any? Well, we don't learn anything about Jar Jar or Qui-Gon or Obi-Wan, and they're the only ones present, so no. Does it flesh out the setting? No. Does it flesh out the theme of the work? No. Is it funny? No. Is it engaging on an intellectual scale because they're talking about something totally unrelated to anything else in the verse? No. You see the problem here. They go through, I mean, really picture this logically speaking. They go through, and there's this big fish chasing them. But then there's a bigger fish that eats that fish. But then there's another fish that's chasing them. Then they lose power for no reason. And then they regain power pretty much at the flick of a switch for all intents and purposes. And then there's a fish, which is then eaten by a bigger fish, and then they move on. My point is, the one thing I feel this scene could have served is dramatic tension for the first act, which otherwise has been lacking because the Jedi have been shown as competent in everything they do. I mentioned this earlier. But the thing is, this is completely manufactured tension because, again, the Jedi are not only completely on top of everything, but they also are never in any danger because, I mean, pay attention to how the scene is structured. They don't actually do anything. They are effectively sitting back and enjoying the ride while the setting fixes the problems that the setting has been throwing at them. Or I should put this more properly, the scene. The scene always resolves itself without their influence or interaction. So they don't actually have anything to work against in order to win. I want to use an example to really get across what I mean here. Empire Strikes Back, asteroid field. The asteroid field represented the scene and the setting throwing obstacles in the face of the I almost said the players, of the main characters, of the protagonists, with the Empire hot on their heels. The Empire in that case doesn't actually serve as an obstacle so much as it serves as an impetus. In other words, the Empire is why they're in a hurry and why they came to this scene. In the previous sample, you could say the droid army is why they were underwater, even though it doesn't actually work, because the droid army didn't chase them underwater, and there's no damned reason they couldn't have just, taken a step and flown over there, or maybe, not landed the droids on the other side of the planet. But moving along, that's the comparison. Then we see the way that the protagonists fix the asteroid problem. They use their ingenuity, their skill, and their patience in dealing with the situation, and their ability to problem solve, which also is how they figure out the nature of their existence within the damn worm, and then manage to get out of it. That was tense, at least by memory. Again, I haven't watched them again lately. My nose itches. By contrast, none of that is present in the underwater section. Thematically, structurally, plot-wise, anything. The heroes, this is effectively what the heroes are doing for the entire underwater section. Wake me when we get to Naboo. Oh, hang on, let's turn the power back on. Okay. They're on autopilot. Or, if you prefer the D&D term, they're being railroaded. Also a sign of bad writing. One more point, and by one more I mean I'm probably going to be talking about this throughout the entire piece, that speaks to the complacency of the perspective of this people in this era and the overall societal decay of the Old Republic, is the fact that it is considered the best possible option not only by the elected ruler of a planet and her best advisors, but by Jedi Knights, who one of whom is, for all intents and purposes, a Jedi Master, to go run for help in order to try and get legal justification in order to ensure that the enemy does not have legal justification, which will then end the threat rather than anything else at all. Oh my God. I'll talk about this more a bit later, but I've often said that the reason why Phantom Menace failed where so many other things have succeeded is because it focused more on the bureaucracy than the politics. Politics is something that's interesting, and I know I'm not alone in this. I mean, I could name a dozen examples, but I'm just going to go ahead and say it. Game of Thrones and the Song of Fire and Ice series is a political story with some sex and violence and zombies thrown in. And I'm not trying to speak derogatory of that series. That's not the point. The point is, the reason that setting and series is so interesting to so many people is because of the politics. It is an incredibly political story. That is something that people find interesting in a fictional thing. This is not new. Final Fantasy Tactics, Final Fantasy XII, Babylon 5, Dragon Age, all of these things, Mass Effect, at least the first one, All of these things have a great deal of political story and intrigue, which make their stories interesting. The problem is there's two things you need to do to make something politically interesting. One, it has to be complicated by its nature, because that's what politics is. Complicated. Politics, and I talked about this just recently on my Dragon Age stream, plug again, is politics is best described as the interaction between two individuals, two or more. In other words, it is so loosely defined because it can be basically anything when it comes to social interaction. That is politics. There's a reason why there are individual politics, office politics, politics between you and your family, politics between you and your extended family, your clan, if you will, politics between people who happen to live in the same place as you and people who happen to not, and so forth and so on, all the way up the layers. That's politics. Politics is all about the social interaction one with another. Bureaucracy, as I always like to define it, is the actual mundane realities of implementing politics. Here's the problem. Bureaucracy is one of those things that, especially in real life, is a fundamental requirement of a political system to exist, for good and for bad. Bureaucracy is, like I said, how politics are implemented, okay? Well, I shouldn't say that. That's actually a bad way to put it. Bureaucracy is how rule is implemented. It's probably a better way to put that. Because bureaucracy is not necessarily married to politics. You know, a government needs some kind of bureaucracy in order to function. This is actually mentioned in A New Hope, actually. But what we get in Phantome Menace is very little politics, and I mean, and much more bureaucracy. Just to make a point here, we get more about Jedi politics, which I'll talk about later, and the politics between the Gungans and the Naboo, which I'll talk about later, than we do about any of the things going on with the Trade Federation or their movements or whatnot. Instead, it's all about the legalese of exactly how they're doing what they've already done. You see the difference? Now, granted, it takes a specific type of mind to write a political story, and it's obvious George wanted that. This is yet another example of when I would say, you know, George, look, if you can't shore up your own problems as a writer, and Lord knows you've had the years to try, get someone else to consult. Get someone else to do a script editing. And I mean, for God's sakes, there are times in scripts where a writer, and I'm no exception to this, doesn't know how to write blah because I am not blah. You know, I'm good at tactics, for example, right? I'm good at tactics, I'm good at politics, you know, a few other things like that, so I can write that sort of stuff. Sometimes I've had other writers come to me, and they had this story about, you know, this country, and there's a battle that happens. And instead of actually writing the battle, there's literally a line that just says, big battle happens here. And they looked at me and said, okay, here's the fundamental setup, you know, in most basic terms. These guys are more equipped, these guys are less equipped, blah, blah, blah. These guys need to win in the end. Please write this battle for me. Then I will do that. And there's plenty of people like me who do that kind of consultation work, basically, in order to flesh out a script. This is the reason science advisors exist in movies and television, because most of the time writers don't know science, especially Star Trek writers. But so they write, science advisor here, help flesh out this here, help make this sense here, etc. George could have just said, okay, they go to the Senate and then politics, and then they come out and there's now a vote of no confidence. And then had someone else who actually knows how to write politics come in and rewrite that. Now, I've actually been asked to rewrite that myself. I'm not going to actually do that, purely for time restriction concerns, especially given that it's already taken me most of the last 2 days to work on the video as is, and I'm still working on it as we speak. And I just got a message, which is bad. Okay. Interesting. Forgive me for the intrusion. But the point is, the whole difference between the two is significant because they never actually go into any of the actual politics in the matter as far as that. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Okay, so let's go ahead and rewind a bit. Let's talk about the scene, one of the few scenes that I actually laughed at in this movie. Qui-Gon Jinn walks with a bunch of fighter pilots and a few dignitaries and the Queen and the fake Queen. Talk about that later. Walks right up to the droid and says, "I am taking these people to Coruscant." That actually made me laugh, even this time around. I admit that was actually pretty funny. It's just nice little, almost non sequitur kind of a thing. But the sheer bluntness of which he does it is so wonderful and very Qui-Gon, I might add. I also will point out something that some people haven't ever really thought about, which is funny because it's actually significant for the plot and was done on purpose. The pilots that all go with them, that they free to get on the yacht and then leave, are there with them the entire movie. They're there when they go to Tatooine and land there. They're there when they go to Coruscant. They're there when they come back from Coruscant. We know this especially because they're actually critical to the end plan in the Battle of Naboo, because those are the pilots that take the fighter ships to go up and battle the one battleship. So, interesting little thing there. Could have been fleshed out a little bit more, but it is nice to know that they did actually bother to make that contiguous rather than just have the pilots appear from nowhere in the final thing. I have a note here that says R2 is awesome. I say without hyperbole that R2-D2 is one of my favorite characters from the entirety of the Star Wars this Star Wars era, basically the Clone Wars era and the Galactic Civil War era, is, you know, the 6 movies, in other words. But I wanted to talk about why, and there's 2 big reasons here, and I have 2 notes about this. One, R2-D2 has a similar perspective that C-3PO does, but in a different presentation. Remember I mentioned earlier that C-3PO is the guy who's a totally ordinary person in extraordinary circumstances, and being forced to face those circumstances, and he's just flipping out the entire time, because that's what most normal people would do. By contrast, R2-D2 is a completely ordinary person who comes across as, and I know this sounds weird because I'm describing a droid who doesn't speak English, very much of an everyman. Someone who's just, you know, just like C-3PO, a totally ordinary person for all intents and purposes, but unlike C-3PO, he rises to the occasion. He is humble, quiet, and yet aspires to greatness, and is single-handedly responsible for a significant number of awesome things that happen in order to overall better the setting as a whole, the other characters, and help add a human element to something that really was, well, to the movie in general, which is absolutely required, in my opinion, for any movie of this nature. And I think that's one of the reasons why I like R2-D2 as much as I do. And I just thought I'd mention that. Darth Maul. Maul's interesting. Most of what's interesting about Maul has been done in the extended universe, of course. The book Darth Maul is certainly telling. But the reason Darth Maul is interesting is he was very deliberately left as a non-character, and yet for once it feels like that was something that was done right. His total lack of personality and character and near total lack of lines in the movie actually serves as an excellent contrast to Qui-Gon Jinn and Obi-Wan and the Jedi Council. And that's good, actually. For once, it's actually really indicative of the difference in perspective between the Dark Jedi and the Light Jedi, the Sith and the Council. In other words, the concept of burning away the extraneous and not bothering with social niceties or discussions or debates or deliberations. Just, this is what I want to do, these are my orders, this is how I'm carrying them out, and now I have carried them out. It actually is very indicative of that personality and mindset, and it kind of makes Maul one of the more interesting Jedi. It is debatable, because I know someone's going to ask, it is debatable if Maul qualifies as a Dark Jedi or as a Sith. I'm not going to explain that distinction right here and now. I've talked about that on my stream extensively. Personally, though, I would actually qualify Maul as a Dark Jedi, and arguably one of the better examples of a Dark Jedi in the prequels. But we'll talk about that later. And then Anakin is introduced in the movie. I can tell because my next note is, no offense to Jake Lloyd. Here's the really funny thing. Listen to a lot of Anakin's lines and remove some of the kiddie aspect of their presentation and hear them spoken in a more adult voice. I know that I'm not the only person who thinks this, because I've talked about this before with several people and on my stream, but the idea of him being older fits so well. It's amazing they actually insisted he be a kid for this movie, because he was written like he is older. He is not portrayed as the 7 or 10 or however old he is kid. He is portrayed as if he is a middling teenager who is still struggling with a lot of things in his life. After all, why wouldn't he be? He is, in fact, a slave. A very well-treated slave, relatively speaking, which is something that I find interesting. He and his mother are actually quite well-treated as far as slaves go, but he is still a slave. one other point I want to mention here really quick. It is nice that they do... They kind of mention that they're slaves in such an offhanded kind of a way that as for it to be basically commonplace, which is good, because that is kind of the point, that slavery is commonplace under these circumstances, and it is actually very normal for slaves to be around here, for them to be part of the infrastructure of this particular world, Tatooine in particular, but also the Outer Rim in general. I mention that especially because it's the kind of thing that, because it's so culturally normal, is the kind of thing that I could see being completely overlooked by the Senate of the Old Republic. Because, after all, there's not a lot of political gain to be had on behalf of senators by trying to champion the cause of freeing slaves of worlds who are not actually member states, member worlds of the Republic. So, nice little touch there, even if it was totally unnecessary. Watto is also interesting. I don't think Watto is evil, personally. I don't have much to talk about him, but I don't think he is an evil character. I think he is a good example of what happens when you are put in a setting like that. He is a byproduct of the world and the way the Outer Rim works, not really a root cause of it. And he actually, aside from a few very small points, he does come across as overall a relatively decent person, just not someone who would ever actually aspire to do good, if you follow me. This is actually backed up in Episode 2, I feel like pointing out. Sebulba, I have even less to say. He's an interesting in a biological sense, and it's nice to see an actually alien character, so props there. I have nothing else to say about him because he is a very simple character. He is a bully who is good at sports. One other note here, and I can finally leave page 1. My god. I'm just now getting off page 1, guys. There's a lot of elements of this movie that approach the concept of blind faith in the Force being a good thing. Qui-Gon himself champions this more than once, to the point where I don't think it's even deniable that he and several of the other Jedi basically approach the Force as their faith. Not religion, but their faith. Although, arguably religion too, but I'm getting ahead of myself. I'll talk about the Jedi later. The idea that no matter what happens and no matter how bad the circumstances are, obviously this is all done by intent and designed to some kind of end. Now, from what we know about the Force, that actually does make sense and is probably literally true. But it's interesting to see a character who so completely blindly believes in their faith that they don't even bother to try and work their way through things themselves in some circumstances. I feel like they go just a little bit too far in that. C-3PO. I already kind of talked about C-3PO. I do want to mention something here. I feel like I had another note about this somewhere. Yeah, okay, here it is. There's actually two C-3PO notes. They're kind of separated. I do want to mention that the C-3PO scenes were actually good, I felt, in this movie. A genuine high point. And the other few points where I actually smiled throughout the piece. I will freely admit part of that is nostalgia. Part of that is referencing, right? However, one of the things I do like about the way C-3PO is portrayed is he is portrayed earnestly. Not just literally earnest, the character is earnest, but the way he is portrayed is earnest, as in they're trying to actually celebrate C-3PO as a character, and the scene where he meets R2-D2 actually did make me grin, because the whole point was they wanted that scene to have the significance that it did, and so they tried to make it thus, and it did, if that makes any sense. By contrast, the scene where Anakin and Obi-Wan first met should have had far more significance than it did, and completely fell on its face because everything about that scene was all about Darth Maul and what they're going to do with regards to that. But I digress. Another interesting note, just a brief comparison between Anakin Skywalker, arguably one of the most powerful Jedi in terms of raw Force potential, if not skill, ever, and Revan, arguably one of the blah, 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 blah. One of the things I note between the two, though, is both of them were soldiers. Both of them were damn good at both flying and fighting, and both of them were damn good at mechanics, at engineering, at building, right? I don't mention this to say that there's anything wrong with that. I just think it's interesting that the direct corollary could be made between the two. It actually makes me wonder if significant strength in the Force, raw strength in the Force, can actually lead someone to basically having insight into design, structure, etc. that otherwise wouldn't be there. That's all, just a little note there. I mentioned earlier that there's one talkie scene in this movie I actually like. It's the scene between Anakin, Shmi, and Qui-Gon. Now, other than the removal of Jar Jar from the scene, because he doesn't add anything to the scene, I wouldn't even change anything about that scene. It's actually surprisingly well directed, surprisingly well presented, and one of the more interesting just plain characters conversing with other characters scenes in the entire movie. Which is funny because there's actually quite a few such scenes in this movie, and most of them are not interesting. It's also interesting because, it actually approaches the political angle in a very small yet crucial way. The idea of the perceptions of what the Jedi are, the ideals of what slavery is, the concept of gambling ruling a society that is so... Well, let's just put it this way. Most of the time when gambling has that much of an influence on people, it's because those people are generally downtrodden or not in a particularly good way. And we already know why that is, but even if we didn't, it's very easily to extrapolate that's because of the Hutts and their complete iron grip of most of the systems in this area. Because don't forget, this is a period in time with the Hutt Empire, I'm just going to call it that, is actually pretty damn strong. All definitely interesting stuff, so bravo there. I mentioned that blind faith thing earlier. That is one of the undercurring themes of all of Phantom Menace, which is actually kind of funny. One of the few themes that's obviously from George, but still not completely simple in its approach. The idea that everything works out because it works out in a way and for a purpose, because fate is real. And that's really the best way to put it. Because destiny is real, because fate is real, because there is a way that things are supposed to work out, and that's that. That is kind of a simple concept, but how people interact with that is more interesting to me personally. And it's all emphasized with a single line, which is almost glanced over, but it really caught my attention. Anakin says this to Qui-Gon. I think, Qui-Gon says, I didn't come here to free slaves. And Anakin says, I think you did. Why else would you be here? The idea of why else would he have decided to land here? Why else would they have had the troubles they needed to land here? Why else would they have landed at this particular city on an entire planet? Why else would he have come to this particular area and that particular shop at that particular time? Why else would things have unfolded the way they did if not for the fact that he was here and was meant to free slaves? Or rather, slave. Sometimes wonder what would have happened if he had freed Shmi as well. I'm only going to mention this... briefly. Anakin's desire to help others is probably his most defining character trait. We will see this a lot in everything from this point up until, well, ever, basically. Honestly, though, I feel like the work that actually fleshes out this character trait the most is the Clone Wars television series, which I will not be talking about extensively right now because it's not immediately pertinent, but that being his soul, his attachment to and caring of others is a great idea. And very core and integral to the way he is presented. And I think it is a good thing they showed it early on. Again, even if he was a teenager under these circumstances who still has that caring and concern for others, actually, in my opinion, would have a stronger impact on the story and the character than a kid who cares about others and then continues to in the later on. But it's not just his caring, it's his attachment. Forgive me for giving one example from the Clone Wars, really briefly here. He was the kind of commander, or general, or whatever you want to call it, leader, in the Clone Wars that, unless he had to, refused to accept the loss of his people, would do anything in his power to try and save and help his people. That is very Anakin. It's kind of indicative of the kind of personality he has, and is very indicative of why he ended up turning to the dark side. And, well, in a bad way, but we'll get to that later. The point being, that kind of strong emotional attachment is basically the dark side. The dark side is that emotional strength. The light side is the absence of that, ironically. The absence of emotions, the control, the lucidity, the lack of connections, the lack of attachments. It's one of the reasons why I've always believed that Obi-Wan was a little bit gray too, but I don't want to get too much into that here. Immaculate Conception. Do I need to say anything? Is there anything to be said here? The idea here is again simple. So simple that I don't even want to talk about it. Other people, though, took this idea and did something with it, which is why I don't mind the Immaculate Conception, because it kind of isn't. The midi-chlorians directly... God, I hate just saying the word. Let's just say it properly. The Force directly created life within Shmi to have a child. Okay, that I'm actually kind of okay with because of the way it was used in the story. The original intent is simple and obvious, and again, I don't even feel like mentioning it. But I like what was done with it. I'm going to explain this here very briefly for those of you who are not aware of this. Either Plagueis or Palpatine himself, one of the two, we don't actually know, is the one who actually did that. Here's the thing. The prophecy about the Chosen One and bringing balance to the Force was always a lie. It was something that was planted by the Sith forever ago. We don't know exactly how long ago, to my knowledge. If anyone knows, feel free to let me know. But the point is, Plagueis and Palpatine both learned how to manipulate life more or less directly with the Force. Not just to expand and extend their own lives. This is how Palpatine is able to body hop later on. But in order to create life. Because Palpatine... I don't want to get too much into this discussion, but basically Palpatine wanted the perfect apprentice, who would always be his apprentice, and he would always be the master. Palpatine did not actually follow the rule of two, per se. He followed his interpretation of the rule of two, which is 2 Dark Jedi ruling the galaxy, which is what he would have had if not for the incident on the lava planet. But anyways, I digress. Point being, it was a dumb idea that something good was made out of. And that just kind of is Star Wars in a nutshell, isn't it? So many things about Star Wars have been explained by other people and other works over time, so that you could look at something and say, well, that's dumb. And then someone comes in, well, blah, 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 blah. And they say, oh, well, that's actually kind of cool. And that's just, that really is just Star Wars in a nutshell. But another reason why I say you can't put all blame or all credit on an individual person for something this vast. But I digress. Midichlorians. I've said this on my stream, and I don't really want to rant about midichlorians, so I'm just going to say that they're dumb and move on. But I want to explain a little bit. I want just a little bit. The Force doesn't need explaining. The Force has never really needed explaining. There's 2 things about the Force. One, it's a vaguely mystical energy force that they actually kind of explain in full in the original trilogy. It's an energy field that binds and surrounds us and penetrates us. So it doesn't. It can partially control our actions, but it can also obey our commands. That was all mentioned way back in A New Hope, and it was fleshed out in Empire by Yoda. We didn't need any further explanation of the Force because it was already explained, and trying to give a, frankly, scientific explanation to something that is by its design fantastical and magical in nature is unnecessary. More than anything else, I feel like this is why midichlorians was a dumb move. And it's worth noting it's basically never really mentioned from this point on, too. So take from that what you will, because even George and the people behind the scene were like, okay, this was kind of dumb, let's move on. I just feel like pointing out one tiny other thought about midichlorians, though, and that is blood transfers. Think about that for a moment. Think about the idea that a person has a particular amount of midichlorians in their blood, in their being, and that's what gives them their particular strength in the Force, and then they get a blood transfer or transfer blood to someone else. What happens? What happens if they have to do organ donation? What happens if they have to sit in Kolto and they lose certain chunks of themselves? You know, I mean, there's several ways this can work, and it's never fully explained, and that's good because we all kind of abandoned the midichlorians thing, just like I am now doing. I will now never use that word ever again, hopefully. Probably not, though. There's the C-3PO mote. Okay, the pod race. The pod race is hard to talk about because I like the pod race. I actually know a lot of things about the pod race. I'm going to go ahead and... I made 2 notes here, positive and negatives, right? And by 2 notes, I mean 2 categories of notes. We'll talk about the negatives first. The first and most obvious negative about the pod race is that the story literally comes to a dead stop while the pod race is happening. It literally... Everything that's happening with regards to the overall plot is just put aside so that the pod race can happen. But I shouldn't say the story, I really should say the plot. Because the pod race, we'll go over to a positive now, is actually some good world building. It's interesting in its own right from a cultural perspective, the idea of a race So we understand that, but then with an alien twist, not just the pods and the hovering, the design of the courses themselves, but the idea that this is a race that most humans actually cannot do because they don't have the biology to do it. Not just to survive, but to have the reflexes and skill necessary to maneuver with the severity and under the extreme circumstances that this race happens in. In other words, this is a race that was basically built for aliens by aliens, and I like that. That's some interesting world building right there. Second part. The race is completely illogical in the way it's constructed. This is a negative, of course. And what I mean by that is, if you actually look at the race, it's obviously rigged so that Anakin has to win, basically from the get-go. And when I say rigged, I mean, like, not the actual literal race in lore is rigged, but the shots we see, the design, is rigged. We do not... I mean, there is no actual real tension in that race, per se. It's just... I mean, he falls behind... And then we have a few scenes of him fixing things, and then he's right back up there, but then he falls behind, and then he loses thing, and he doesn't even start at the go. But then he gets right back up there, but then he can't pass him until the significant event happens. It's like each moment in the race is basically a checkpoint, and there's no logical, well, this is actually what's happening during the race following. It isn't self-cohesive, in other words. Another positive thing about this, wait, what's this say? Is the music is actually really good during the pod section, and they even use absence of music as an appropriate musical tool, as it should be. Scenes where there is no music are done to emphasize the scene and are contrasted by the scenes that actually do have music. I should probably go ahead and mention at this point that John Williams is awesome, and I postulate that if you... Well, I'll just put this bluntly. For those of you who do not watch my Voyager videos I do every day, I just recently recorded, and therefore in just a few weeks it will go live, a video talking about the problem with the music in the post... something I think was his name. Anyways, when they started using the wallpaper music, the generic music in Star Trek, which is pretty much all of Voyager and Enterprise, and some of TNG. But... The downs. Imagine how much you would have liked or disliked Star Wars if it had that kind of generic wallpaper paste music going instead of John freaking Williams, one of the greatest composers of our era, if not of all time. Think about the difference that would make. And I just mentioned this because most people don't actually listen to the music for the music's sake in Star Wars movies, and yet they recognize the tones on sight. And I've actually had some people... I've done some tests with people where they're watching a scene and either the audio's off or I've got some other music playing with the audio off, and it completely changes the tone and feel of the scenes. That's one of the reasons why John Williams is so brilliant. He doesn't actually do that great of music that's meant to be listened to by itself. His entire purpose is to make music that completely accents the scene and uplifts everything going on to an even greater level than it already is. In the case of the original trilogy, this made moments that were powerful amazing. In the case of the prequels, it made moments that were lackluster better than they should have been, and made the good moments great as a result. So I just wanted to comment on that really quick. Also, the pod race is just kind of awesome. I'm just going to be honest. It's cool, it's interesting. What do you want from me? Wait, what? Okay, God. I was trying to figure out what the hell my notes was here. I can't even read my own handwriting. Knowing Qui-Gon and his tendency to not only be gray in perspective, we don't know if Qui-Gon ever actually used the dark side. It's actually unlikely, given his perspective, but he was considered a gray under the second definition of gray, which is a Jedi who is not officially ratified by the Jedi Council, which obviously is kind of a dumb definition, but whatever. Anyways, the point being, given his perspective and his willingness to bend the rules and do whatever is necessary as his purposes see fit, I find myself wondering if he actually knew Padme was the Queen in advance. There's never any actual indication of this. I don't even believe even the novelization actually went into this. But I just find that interesting because the way he interacts with Padme, the handmaiden, while they're on Tatooine, is telling in its own way, and makes me think that he actually did know she was the Queen, and was basically daring her to reveal herself to him by basically making a case that she could only refute by revealing herself to him. It would be a very Qui-Gon thing. And also political, I might add, in a small way, but still. I have a brief thought on Jabba the Hutt. Unda Waba Chewbacca. And that's my thought on Jabba the Hutt. No, I'm kidding. For those of you who are not familiar with this, a lot of the things that people love about Star Wars came from the extended universe. There's no denying or avoiding that. It's just true. Now, that being said, the movies, the prequels in specific, tend to do this weird half and half off thing that I myself do as well, actually. They look at some things and they say, okay, we'll use that from the extended universe, but we will ignore continuity over here. And so they kind of pick and choose, right? I only mention this because Jabba the Hutt, as he is in the extended universe, is portrayed as brilliant, intelligent, driven, and probably one of the most progressive of the Hutts. In fact, he was actually pretty awesome right up until he started doing spice. And then he kept doing spice, and then he kept doing spice, and that's why we see the Jabba that we see in Return of the Jedi. Because that happened right around Empire, a little before Empire, actually. I just mentioned that because the Jabba we see in this movie is pretty much the Jabba we see in Return. The lazy, slovenly, doesn't care kind of individual, which doesn't really fit his personality. And in truth, doesn't even fully fit with his portrayal in A New Hope, which is why I've kind of shake my head at that. Probably just didn't actually think about it, but I digress. Oh, and by the way, Hutts live a long time, so it's not really incongruent that he's there. They live centuries. Real quick note about the race before I move on. The sound design for the race is phenomenal. One of the things that ILM has always been known for is their excellent special effects, but most people tend to forget that that includes sound effects as well. Their sound designs have always been top-notch. The hum of the lightsaber and that noise, the way the TIE fighters sound, the unique keen of the blaster shots and the turbo lasers, and all of that is them showing their sound effects skill. And I've said it before and I've said it again. You can tell good sound design when you don't really notice it, but its absence would make a scene worse. And that is very present in the prequels, but especially during this race. Pay attention to the different noises that the different pods make. Even after like a few minutes or a few seconds of watching, you can already tell which pod is which just by audio cue. And the way they're presented with the Doppler effect and the sine waves and all the other fun, awesome things they do with the sound. It's really good stuff. Forgive me for geeking out. I obviously like sound design a lot. One other little note here. The aquatic droids thought is what I have written down. They mention that they're going to scour the Gungan cities, but the Gungan cities are underwater and they have droids. And they only have droids. So how do they scour the underwater cities? You can see where I'm going with this. It's a thought that was fleshed out a little bit in the Clone Wars extended thing. The idea that there are droids which are basically designed solely for combat in water environments, which makes a lot of sense, given that there are actually quite a few aquatic environments throughout the Star Wars setting, and it makes sense to an extent in the perspective of the Clone Wars, because by then they're fighting war on a galactic scale, but I find myself wondering when the Trade Federation had need for droids that could go underwater. Anyways, of course it is also worth noting droids can pilot vehicles which can go to water as well, which could just bypass that, and maybe they didn't get that until later. I just thought I'd mention it because it was a little question mark. A couple little points here. First, we'll be cynical. Okay, now that we're done being cynical, I have to mention, there's only really 3 good scenes between Padme and Anakin in this movie. And by in this movie, I mean in this trilogy, in my opinion. 3 of them. I can tell you all 3 of them right now. The scene where they're on her ship, heading to Coruscant, which is the scene I'm talking about right now. The scene where he finds out they're pregnant. I'll talk about them more in Episode 2. And the scene where neither of them have any dialogue, which is, in my opinion, the best scene in the entire prequel trilogy. That's the scene in Episode 3, ironically. One good scene, one great scene per movie. But I just have to mention that it is ironic that this is a genuinely good scene between the two of them. It shows them getting closer on a friend level and on a caring for each other level with no romantic connotations at all, which is probably the only thing you could have done well with the fact that he was a kid, showing that there was a friendship before a romance. Except there's 2 problems with that. One, that friendship is never allowed to bloom because then they're separated for years because Jedi are stupid. And 2, that still could have worked if he was a teenager. Again, picture this scene as if there was teenager Anakin. He's huddled in the corner, and the whole time you've seen him energetic, exuberant, skilled, confident, boastful even. This is the first scene. He is literally shivering over in the corner, and she sees him, and he freezes up for a second because he's vulnerable and he's being perceived by her. But there's no judgment. There's no reason to feel ashamed around her. He doesn't have to feel like she's looking down on him. She just comes over and comforts him, gets him a blanket, and they start talking. No romantic connections, no physical intimacy or otherwise desire isn't necessary at all, because it's all just about the two of them growing closer as people so that they can become friends and then later grow into an actual relationship, you see? And that would have changed the scene amazingly, but even without the need for that change, I still think the scene works very well, especially for a couple things. Another one, the Japor snippet. This is actually kind of funny in its own right, because it really shows how much that meant to Padme, that she kept it for years, even after she didn't interact with him for years. And furthermore, it was supposed to be given away, but she actually ended up being buried with it. There's a story behind that. I don't want to go into it. There's a story behind everything in Star Wars, by the way, if you didn't know this. But finally, this isn't just a scene about Anakin. It's a scene about Padme. And I think that's the reason I like it, because it's probably the first and indeed only scene in all of Episode 1 that really fleshes out Anakin as a character and Padme as a character. Everything else, they're trying to do things to live up to their various roles, and you can extrapolate things about their character, but this scene is just about their characters, because we see Padme at her most vulnerable here. She doesn't have to maintain the illusion of the queen. She doesn't have to maintain the commanding and regal presence that she has to demand. She doesn't have to maintain the illusion of being the handmaiden. I'll talk about more of that later. Instead, it's just Padme, the person, and Anakin, the person. That's why I like that scene. And good scene. Coruscant is awesome! I have to admit, I've always loved the idea of an Ecumenopolis in general. A city-wide planet, basically, or a city-wide planet. Wow, that'd be terrible. A planet-wide city. But one of the other things that I find absolutely... two things about Coruscant. Number one, basically, the Coruscant that we know and love and hate, and love and hate, is one of those trillion things that we can owe thanks to Timothy Zahn for. Coruscant had been mentioned in a few of the backstories, and he didn't come up with it out of nowhere. Coruscant is actually how I used to pronounce it before it was finally said out loud. But in the game Rebellion, if anyone's curious. But he gave us the idea of the Ecumenopolis, and he did it for the exact reason that I am now going to extrapolate on, because Coruscant was indicative of the Old Republic. Think about this for a moment. Coruscant is the single biggest symbol of everything that is true about the Old Republic. It is unwieldy, vast, has tons and tons of rot underneath it, and is wildly impractical and almost infeasible. It is not impossible. That's the funny thing about it. People have actually done the math and the working out and the logistics, really mostly logistics, of actually keeping a planet like Coruscant functional. And it is possible. But it is costly and ludicrously complicated and expensive to maintain. The amount of infrastructure and bureaucracy devoted just to keeping that planet functional, just to keep it supplied with food and water and air and power is insane, but possible. And that's important, because Coruscant is okay, let me explain. Let me use terms that don't define to the city itself. It is a thing that is unwieldy and doesn't really work efficiently or properly, but can be made to work with significant effort and stress in order to keep it going, even as it rots from within. You see why Coruscant is the symbol of the Old Republic? This is what Timothy Zahn intended with Coruscant to be. That's why he wrote it the way he did, and why every other author since has extrapolated on that same idea. But I like that we get an up-close picture of Coruscant here for two big reasons. One, it looks amazing. I'm sorry, the design of Coruscant is top-notch. It's one of the few things, special effects-wise, I would not even touch if I went back. If I was given the reins of Phantom Menace to make a new movie, I would say, nope, it's good. Two big reasons why. And number one, it's... The challenge in designing a city that stretches to the horizon like that is harder than you'd think, and they do a good job with emphasizing the fact that there's the skyscrapers, and then there's the not skyscrapers. There's the normal buildings, really gets across that difference between the upper class and the lower class that is very also indicative of the Old Republic. Second reason, though, everything up top is shiny. This is the one and only example, I think, that is acceptable, although I still wish Coruscant looked a little more worn in, had that same aesthetic of Star Wars. But nevertheless, that overall shiny, glittering, oh, it's all pretty, beautiful and pristine thing very much fits because that is the surface of things. The surface of the Old Republic is very pretty and very shiny. Underneath that, it gets a little bit worse. So, Terrence Stamp plays an unfortunately small role given how actually surprisingly important he is to the role, and yet Terrence actually does a surprisingly good performance of him. In some of his scenes, he's a little bit too wooden, but the scene where the vote of no confidence is given out, he is actually allowed to act. It's just one scene, but it speaks volumes. In that, we see a man who is ineffectual, and yet not incompetent, who is just smart enough to realize just how powerless he really is. Someone who has long since resigned himself to his own powerlessness, who has stopped trying to be more and be better and accomplish different because he knows he can't, or at least has convinced himself he can't, which is why he's ineffectual and an ineffectual leader. And one of the only things I find truthful, well, okay, I don't want to get too much into that just yet, but it is worth noting that Palpatine lies by telling the truth constantly in this movie. And one of those truths that he uses to deceive is, we need a strong chancellor. We need a strong leader, one who can control the bureaucrats, one who can control the politics, one who can control the Senate. And that is exactly correct. The Republic did need that. And Palpatine was that person. But you can see why that's still a deception. Ian McDiarmid, I haven't talked about him too much yet. He actually has a very significant role in the prequel, and honestly I feel like that's one of the reasons I tend to remember Episode 1 as fondly as I do. And I'm just going to be blunt about it. I've never been quiet about the fact that Emperor Palpatine is my favorite villain of all time, across all of fiction. And most of that is due to the extended universe, of course, which fleshes him out to the nth degree. But even in the movies, he is still clearly that character. There is nothing in the movies that contradicts or contrasts the way he is fleshed out in the extended universe, which is why I maintain that appearance. And one of the so that's one of the reasons why I love Palpatine. It's the extended universe. The other reason is Ian McDiarmid. For those of you who don't know, he is the same actor who played Palpatine all the way back in Return of the Jedi. Same guy. It's actually funny because he needed more makeup then because he was a lot younger then. That was, like 25 years prior or something like that. But Ian McDiarmid is an accomplished theatrical actor. He doesn't actually do much when it comes to movies. Usually he does it as favors for people he knows. Not favors like, give me this stuff. No, he does it like, someone who knows him or he knows asks him, hey, I need a good actor for role B. Would you please be in this? And he'll do it. And he was asked to come back for Palpatine, and he leapt at the opportunity because he is portraying a role that honestly a lot of actors, especially theater actors, would love to portray. He is effectively playing Jekyll and Hyde because Palpatine's self-control and power is so monumental that he is, for all intents and purposes, from an acting perspective, two different characters. And so Ian McDiarmid literally approached playing Sidious as if he was playing the old role, and Senator Palpatine, as if he was a kindly old man. And his simple earnestness and nicety and the kindly nature, and he just kind of radiates that sort of, I'm here to help, comforting charisma. And that's all Ian McDiarmid. And he does a great job of it, because it's exactly the kind of thing Palpatine would do. To portray himself not as someone who is, a strong leader who will lead us to glory for the greater good. He not portray himself as someone who is incredibly competent and skilled. He portrays himself as a simple, ineffectual, kindly old man. The extended universe goes into great detail on the specifics of how he secured the Supreme Chancellorship. It wasn't just the vote. It wasn't just the sympathy vote that he got for his planet being under attack. It was believed, this is kind of paraphrasing, it was believed by the people who wanted to use the Senate for their own means and purposes, the corrupt, in other words, that he would be so ineffectual that he would not be able to be used, he would be used as a tool. So it would be to their political advantage to have someone so ineffectual in charge. And the people who wanted to do reform and change, for good and for evil, saw him as someone they could utilize for their own purposes in order to push things through the Senate, in order to try and get rid of those corrupt people who are just trying to maintain a stagnant status quo. Both sides thought they could use Palpatine for their own purposes because he intentionally portrayed himself as this ineffectual, kindly, simple old man. Oh, I love it. I also find myself wondering how much of what he says in this movie is true. Obviously, a great deal of it is because that's his style. He deceives through truth. But he says a lot of things about how, he basically stonewalls her into the perspective of doing the vote of no confidence. The only other option is going through the courts, and the Senate is corrupt and unjust, etc. I wonder how much of that was a lie? Or how much of that was engineered to be that way so he wouldn't have to lie. Just food for thought. Now, here's the funny part. I mentioned we would talk about Jedi politics, and so we shall. Because Jedi politics really, the hell? Jedi politics are really on display here. There's a line by Obi-Wan that speaks volumes. I forget the exact wording, even though I just finished watching the movie, forgive me, but it was something along the lines of, you would be on the council yourself if only you would follow the rules. That line, and the overall portrayal of the Jedi, especially in episodes 2 and 3, where they started fleshing out the more simple thoughts that George had, really demonstrates that the Jedi Knights, the Jedi Council, are just as stupid as the Sith, not just because of their other reasons, which I'll get into in a moment, but because advancement in the Council is dependent upon adherence to doctrine. Not competence, not skill, not results, not even political connections, such as it is. Adherence to doctrine. Party doctrine, if I'm not getting the point across enough here. And that I found absolutely fascinating and very indicative. What we see, and I'm going to talk about this more later, especially in Episode 3, what we see from the Jedi Council is a picture of Yoda founding the Jedi Council, this modern Jedi Council, under the precepts that he learned when he was young and didn't know any better, that he felt were the only way to prevent the war that just happened with Bane and all that fun stuff from happening again. Maybe it wasn't Bane. I forget which Sith Lord that one was, but Yoda was around for that one, or rather around for right after that one. Anyways, I'm getting off topic. And so Yoda, who is so revered and so loved and so beloved and so knowledgeable in wisdom and strong in the Force, basically no one ever questioned him. And so around Yoda was built what is effectively a zealot party policy, as opposed to anything else. I mean, it's basically a platform, a political platform is what it is for all intents and purposes. And the zealotry with which the Jedi adhere to it is kind of scary, and gets more scary as the prequels go on, especially when we start getting into the books. And I always feel like Yoda is kind of also a victim in this, but I'll talk about that more when we get to Episode 3. Where am I? It's also worth noting that the Jedi's stupidity is also on display in this episode because they are definitely the writ law versus the intent law. In other words, they will follow the letter of the law at the expense of the intent of the law. Another good example of this, they would literally rather Anakin go free and just go back to his life, untrained and unfulfilled and all those other things, rather than train him to actually have self-discipline and mental strength and all those other things that can, be useful for someone who they know is incredibly powerful in the Force, because that's the rules. And that's their reason. That's all of their reason. It's in the rules. Now, in the interest of fairness, there is a reason that law exists, why they only train people who are of a certain age. Because after a certain age, a person is going to be more susceptible to the dark side. And that's the reason. There are some good reasons to do that. There are also some incredibly bad and stupid reasons to do that. But they would rather let him go free and be whatever than train him just because of that law. And that is so indicative of the Jedi Council and why they are, in their own special way, just as retarded as the Sith are. Now, I mentioned earlier that, I've mentioned on the stream, actually, I don't think I've mentioned in this video. How long have I been recording, I wonder? The idea that there's a lot of bad lines, and a good actor can only salvage a bad line so much. There's a line by Samuel L. Jackson as Mace Windu that just struck a nerve, and I actually had to rewind and write it down, and challenge myself to rewrite it. Because the way he says the line is so wooden and so bland that I just find myself thinking, really? And that line is, "This is the clue we need to unravel the mystery of the Sith." That's a bad line. And it's obvious that he was being directed to do it in an impassionate, kind of robot-like manner, which comes across as wooden and boring. See the problems with portraying a Vulcan over on my Voyager reviews if you don't understand what I mean by that. I challenged myself to rewrite this line to make it a little more human-sounding. So here's my stab at this. I'm sure you'll hate this, but we must ascertain the truth of these matters. Sith or no. That's how I would have phrased that line. And I just feel like mentioning that because there's actually a lot of lines in the whole movie that are like that. Just that one really struck me. Later on, and by later on I mean like the next scene, Qui-Gon actually explains midichlorians to Anakin, and does so in the dumbest way possible. This is basically the last time midichlorians are like mentioned, pretty much ever, is this scene when Qui-Gon explains them to Anakin. Here's the thing. The way he explains them is actually contradictory. Pay attention to what he says and why he says. I'm not going to dissect it right here, because that would take too long, and frankly, it's not worth my time. And I knew I'd say that word again. I knew it, but pay attention to the way he explains it, and the facts he presents about midichlorians and the Force. And really think about it. It's self-contradicting when you actually consider it. So here's what I have a note here called the Jar Jar equation. Now, I mentioned earlier that you could just remove Jar Jar from the movie entirely, and the masses would rejoice. But I also mentioned that if you didn't want to do that, you could remove Jar Jar after he served as the link between the crew to the Gungan city. The reason I mentioned that was because it is also possible for him to be relevant later, aka right here. When they get back to Naboo, he serves as a link for them to find the Gungans now that they have fled in the face of the droid invasion, right? So it is possible for Jar Jar to actually serve a purpose. And if we wanted to not cut him in completely, and maybe make him less irritating of a character, you could have him reintroduced here. Hey Jar Jar, remember me? Oh, I remember you. You saved my life. Yeah, we're looking for the Gungans because we need help. Oh, I know where they can find them. Ta-da. Now I know what you're saying. The only reason that Padme knows that the Gungans have an army is because Jar Jar mentions it offhandedly. But it would not be hard to write the fact that she knew that army existed to begin with, or indeed that she was seeking help regardless from them. So that's not really what you'd call a plot hole, it's just there. One other thing I've been asked to comment on, I often get asked to comment on military strategy when it comes to movies, books, games, etc., because, as I mentioned, I actually have quite a bit of a tactical mind. There is one single battleship in orbit of Naboo. Now, there's 2 points about this. One, that is militarily logical. They have no need to maintain extensive support, especially given it would be very expensive to do so, and the Trade Federation, being an economic superpower rather than a military one, primarily at least, would probably be interested in keeping their expenses low for something that's otherwise basically unnecessary. So yeah, it makes sense that they would only leave a single battleship in orbit of Naboo. After all, it's their planet now, for all intents and purposes, if not legally. However, the other thing I want to talk about militarily here is this is also fully indicative of the time and concept and the lack of appreciation of personal power I mentioned far earlier in this video. In other words, this is the dumbest possible thing they could do militarily, because they literally have 2 single points of failure for their entire military force. 2! If you don't understand what I mean, the Viceroy himself is a point of failure. I'll talk about that more in a moment. And the battleship is a point of failure. If either of these things fails, they have lost. Like that. Single point of failure, that's why it's called that. 1 point is removed, and the whole thing fails. That is retarded, militarily speaking. But it's very indicative of the general complacency and lack of military doctrine they have. After all, who's going to stand up and oppress them or oppose them? And the other funny thing is, of course, they think that, as soon this whole thing is going to be legalized, so they won't even need that battleship on board. They can do something else, either locally or just, have their own personal droids going on. I mean, there's plenty of options there. Speaking of which, I'm just going to mention this really quick, and then we'll talk about the Neimoidians and the Trade Federation, because I actually have something to talk about there, but I don't know. Why is there a duplicate for the Queen? Why? Why does that exist in lore or out? If you say it's her bodyguard, I'm going to smack you because that's stupid. Why does the Queen of a peaceful planet who is democratically elected, who has no military capacity whatsoever, and no strife or internal, civil war or otherwise difficulties, need a damn bodyguard who is a complete body double bodyguard, the extra layer of bodyguard? Why is that necessary? Now, it's actually really obvious, even the first time watching this, that they had two actors playing the Queen. My actual first thought was that they had acting troubles and it was a production value issue, not that she was supposed to be a body double, because it's really obvious when actress whose name I can't think of is playing the Queen, and body double actress is playing the Queen. But okay, so we have no in-lore explanation, really, because she doesn't need a bodyguard of that extensiveness or capacity. She is useful once, and it would be much more useful in the Episode 2 and 3 eras when the Clone Wars and the Separatists have become a thing and she's in personal danger. So yeah, I make that sense, but why now? But that brings us to the other reason why it's dumb. Why out of character? From a story perspective, why have the switch? It's almost literally like they wanted to have a plot twist for no reason. They just wanted to have something to make you go, ah! And that's it. It doesn't serve any purpose. It doesn't add to anything. It doesn't flesh out her character, or the setting, or the politics, or the themes, or anything. It's just pointless. Why? Okay, I'm done. Let's talk about Neimoidians and the Trade Federation. The Trade Federation is fascinating to me from a political and cultural perspective. I don't know if this is true for all Neimoidians. The ones we do see in ancillary works do tend to support this, though. The Neimoidian perspective is basically politics taken to its extreme. In other words, I must avoid all blame and all responsibility for everything. At no point... It's actually kind of funny because the Bothans have a similar perspective to a less severe extreme, all things considered. I want to make sure that I have as much personal indulgence, not power, indulgence as possible, whether that's in terms of money or power or in luxuries or whatever, but I want to make sure that I don't have to actually do anything or be responsible for anything. If things go badly, I want to make sure it's someone else's fault. That pretty much explains their culture in a nutshell. It also explains why they are ultimately completely weak to the point of being pathetic. Because that single point of failure thing exists because the person on top has all that responsibility and blame. Now, obviously, whoever is on top of the pile still has that Neimoidian philosophy. Newt Gunray, however you say his name, also has that perspective of being the person who wants to push the blame on others and doesn't want to take things for himself. But ultimately, he kind of has to when it comes to his own affairs because he's the viceroy. He's the one person, the one oddity amongst the Neimoidian and Trade Federation culture that decided to crawl his way to the top of that and actually become someone and have responsibility, blame, and the things that come with that, which include power. And so that's one of the reasons why there's that single point of failure, and it's actually funny because that is mirrored brilliantly in their usage of the droid army. I've talked about how the droid army is significant of the setting as a whole, but it's also significant of the Trade Federation, and of Newt Gunray, and of the Neimoidians in general. Because the droids are expendable, yes, and they're cheap, yes. But the real point is, the droids are in this point the responsibility. They could arm Neimoidians, train Neimoidians, but then they would have to actually go out and deal with things themselves. Much better to get someone else to do it. I feel like this society kind of was deadlocked with regards to any military capacity until the droid idea came up, because of the fact that no matter what you do, nobody wanted to be the one holding the gun. You follow? But the usage of droids to such an extensive degree, to the point where half their ship's complement is droids, for God's sakes. Never mind their entire army and navy, at least as far as fighter capacity, is all droids, because they actually have fighter droids. is so indicative of that personality and that concept, which again is mirrored brilliantly, or unintentionally, one of the two, in that single point of failure. They have one control thing, which is handling the entirety of everything, because, well, that's because how they think. That's how they think, isn't it? Just fascinating there. The coincidence battle, the Battle of Naboo. I didn't do that on purpose. My note actually here does say coincidence battle. It is actually well constructed, and again, the good example of, and I have the good directing note right there. This is a good example of George's directing in a nutshell. He does know how to do big battle scenes and big bombastic action like this pretty well. He also knows how to structure it well. And it's kind of funny because all of his big battle scenes tend to follow the same general pattern. It's like this. They start out in the battle, and oh my god, everything's going on, and the battle, in some way or another, boils down to the point where it's a lot easier to keep track of the specifics we care about. The initial battle of Episode 3 is probably the best example of this, but all of them are like this. So we are, big battle, okay, here's what we care about. In Episode 1, it's, there's the space battle, the ground battle, and the personal battle, and I guess the palace invasion. So here's the 4 specific points we're following now, and they start to have success and win, and then things start to go badly, and then they have the darkness before the hope spot, or whatever you want to call that. In other words, everything goes to hell, and then something turns around just barely, but that sets off a domino effect, which makes things get better, and then they manage to have the success, usually in a skin of their teeth kind of a situation. The Battle of Yavin at the Death Star is also an excellent example of this format. But this is also a good example of what I've said many times before. You don't necessarily have to do something new to do something good. I'm not one of those hipster people who insists that anything that is replicated or duplicated in terms of personality, style, or structure, see the Elder Scrolls games, the Pokemon games, etc., is necessarily bad. It's how well you do it. And in my opinion, the Battle of Naboo is actually quite well constructed. Not as well as other works, including the ones I've mentioned, but still well constructed. So, good directing, George. I gotta admit, I still got chills. I don't know how long it's been now, probably an hour or so, but whatever. I still got chills when Darth Maul showed up and Duel of the Fates started up. Awesome song, perfectly emphasizes the scene, and really, really fleshes out the thing. And the way it was presented is perfect. Couple notes about, by couple I mean like 5 notes about the battle between Maul and the 2 Jedi. I don't have many notes about the rest of the battle. There's not really much to share there. I've already talked about that. First of all, the way they approach each other is perfect. No attempt is made to gain advantage or to try and take the other off guard. Instead, the 2 Jedi stand off against the Sith. All of them have a chance to take off their robes, stretch, get themselves ready, get their weapons ready. Darth Maul lets them just like they let him. They let him because they are Jedi. They are here to defend, not attack, to ascertain the truth of these matters, Sith or no. He is here because he wants to test himself. Maul has never been able to go full tilt and unleash on anyone because no one has ever been able to stand up to him and his raw skill. Maul is not actually that powerful in the Force. It has been argued he is actually very weak in the Force, but he is tremendously skilled in combat. And that's one of the reasons why he is an apt opponent for Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan. One of whom is powerful, and the other one whom and skilled, another one who is potential but not skilled. So he really wanted to have that fight. He could have probably taken them by surprise or brought them down quicker or taken advantage to gain an early advantage in the fight, but no. He stood there and waited for them to be ready so he could have the fight he wanted. Which brings me to my next point. One of the reasons I mentioned Maul is one of the better examples of a Dark Jedi is because of the sheer joy that is so obvious as he's fighting those two. This is hard to explain, and I'll talk about this more in Episode 3 as well. One of the things that a Dark Jedi has to do, whether they are Sith or just a Dark Jedi, is they have to constantly maintain a surprising amount of self-control because you can't burn constantly. It doesn't work that way. So they have to maintain those emotions that will give them their strength through the Force, but they can't let them be unleashed all the time, otherwise they'll be spent. So Maul is someone who has been very restrained the entire movie, and then finally gets to actually unleash himself. And it's not just anger or rage that drives him. Because the dark side is not about negative emotions, remember. It is not about evil. The dark side is about emotion, passion, severe and strong emotional connections and whatnot. And so his utter and absolute joy at the battle he's having with Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan is part of what powers him to have the strength he does through the Force in order to match two much more experienced and arguably one more skilled Jedi. And I just thought that was wonderful, and a wonderful showcasing of how a Dark Jedi can and should operate. Then there's the force field scene. The force field scene is awesome because it shows the true contrast between the light side and the dark side in one beautiful visual metaphor. No dialogue, none necessary. The force field cuts them off, and then Darth Maul angrily is like, "Oh, what?" and goes to he actually tries to attack the force field with his saber, and then paces angrily. By contrast, Qui-Gon, the moment he shot it, immediately shuts off his lightsaber, and then gets himself in preparation to kneel in meditation. There are two ways this is brilliant. One is the obvious. Again, the dark side is about passion and emotion. When it is interrupted, when it cannot flow, all it can do is pace. All it can do is just kind of like, oh, come on. By contrast, the light side is all about control, peace, calm, lack of attachment, lack of emotion. So Qui-Gon regains his strength and his focus by just kneeling there meditating. And when the force field comes off, he's ready instantly. Maul gets no advantage on him. He's lightsaber done, parry block. Because he was in control. He was calm, peaceful. Now, granted, he still lost, but moving along. The other reason it shows the contrast between the light and the dark side is the main reason why it's arguable the light side is overall stronger. And why the gray side, except there is no gray side, but why gray Jedi tend to be the ones that tend to be galaxy movers. Because a usage of both is generally going to be preferable because dark side works better in the short term, light side works better in the long term. If you need something done now, the dark side is basically the best way to go. It is quicker and easier, as Yoda himself said, and more seductive as a result of that. But the truth of the matter is, the heat of passion and emotions is better to flame right now. But maintaining that over a long period of time is much, much harder and much more difficult, and gets to the point where it basically will peter out. By contrast, the light side is very much about, kind of letting things be and working through things the way they will. And so if you need something done now, the light side is probably not going to be nearly as effective, but as long as you maintain your focus, your control, your lucidity, the light side will not peter out. It will maintain and endure over time, arguably getting stronger over time. Although, again, also arguably to the detriment of the individual, but I'm getting ahead of myself. One last thing, well, two last things before I talk about the other thing here. Maul kills Qui-Gon Jinn. Awesome scene. He just gets him right through the chest. Qui-Gon goes, oh my god. And then Maul is instantly, just like that, he's over by the force field ready for Obi-Wan. That again highlights Maul's personality and the dark side perspective in general. He's not ready to gloat yet because he knows he has not won. This is the difference between a Sith and the Dark Jedi. A Sith, by the stupid definition as I've used many, many times, in that perspective would be like, oh, I have won, and now you have to finish. They would gloat. They would bask in the moment. Maul, who is a Dark Jedi, does no such thing because he's not done yet. He has to keep his emotions and his strength high because he's got one more opponent left. And so he goes, and with absolute wonderful efficiency and ruthless brutality, just goes straight over and is right there ready for Obi-Wan. Awesome scene. Then Obi-Wan wins because of stupidity. There is no way to excuse this, in my blunt opinion. I actually sat down and counted. From the moment Maul realizes Obi-Wan is doing something, and I'm using that point specifically, 16 seconds pass before Obi-Wan actually has the chance to slice him in half. 16 seconds of Darth Maul, Mr. Efficient, Ruthless, Skilled, Badass Machine, stands there literally doing nothing for 16 seconds. If that doesn't sound long, I would like you to do something for me. I would like you to pretend that someone is trying to attack you as of this very second go. and you're dead. In the middle of a pitched fight, that is a lifetime. And it takes forever for Obi-Wan to actually do all the things he needs to do. And that was such a cheap thing for me. I would have loved it if Obi-Wan had just beaten him fairly, just like, honestly, Maul beat Qui-Gon. Maul didn't beat Qui-Gon by cheating, or by having the setting, work to make him win. He beat him because he got in a blow that Qui-Gon didn't dodge, and that's it. Obi-Wan is a skilled lightsaber duelist. Always has been. That's always been a part of his character. A New Hope's timid lightsaber fight notwithstanding. So, just have Obi-Wan flat up beat Maul. Why go through this whole thing about that? Well, I can answer that question. It's because of that darkest moment before the dawn thing. George, with his simple perspective, didn't realize that the death of Qui-Gon could have been that dark moment. The Gungans are losing, the people around the ship are being blown up to hell, and the Queen has just been captured, and Qui-Gon's freaking dead. You don't need to have you dangling over a cliff to get across the point that things are bad. Qui-Gon's dead. We got the point. One other point, though, about that. The entire Duel of the Maul, just say Duel of the Fates, and not the song, the Darth Maul duel with Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan, is probably the best way to put a microscope on Episode's problems in a nutshell. It's fun, it's good, it's engaging, it's interesting, there's no depth to it whatsoever, it's not fully thought out, it has a lot of logical hiccups and flaws, and it ends badly. Think about it. Why are those force fields there and spread out in just that way with that little time loop happening? People have tried to explain why they're there, but even people who try to explain that basically say, yeah, it's there because it's there for the fight. Why is there this massive power area that they can reach that's in the palace that just happens to be perfect for the kind of platform-to-platform dual jumping they have? Why is there a pit that leads into oblivion just underneath this area in this force field area? I mean, why is it that Obi-Wan manages to defeat him in such... I could keep going, but the point is, it's not logical, it's not self-consistent, just like the race wasn't. It's still fun. It's still entertaining. It's incredibly well choreographed. And I gotta say, having literally just yesterday watched an episode of Voyager and commented on the choreography for the video I recorded for that episode, it was nice to see genuinely good choreography on display. But no. 2 more questions. And then these are my last points. And then we're finally done. Why have a happy ending? Now, if I was a kind, generous, and way more blind than I am individual, I would say that the happy ending was done deliberately to emphasize the fact that everything in the setting has just gotten worse. And that this is clearly the beginning of a very dark time. And so we need this big, extravagant celebration to, A, have the enjoyment of the moment. The fact that we had one victory. This is the same reason they had a New Hope celebration in canon. In lore, the reason they had that big ceremony is because, the war may be going and everything's going to be about worse and the Empire's just doubled down on their military presence and all that horrible stuff. But at least we got this victory in. So they needed that celebration. If you actually read the books, the next day they were gone. So they had that one time, that one night, to celebrate, and it was necessary for morale and not just for basic humanity. So I get that. The other reason to do it is to emphasize the fact that nobody has any idea how bad things really are. Unlike the A New Hope's example, where everyone is fully aware of just how bad things are and are about to be, nobody realizes how bad the Republic is and how bad things have just become. And so their naivety and indeed ignorance in the matter is emphasized by how lavishly they go out of their way to celebrate. Now, of course, these things are not true because simplicity, as I've emphasized a few trillion times, and that is the actual answer. The actual answer is a simple ending. It is a nice, happy way to end the movie, the end. That's George's mindset in a nutshell. Final thought. I find it very telling and indicative of the way his character will go. I wish this was on purpose, but I'm not sure if it is or not. It feels like it is, though. The Jedi Council agrees to allow Anakin to be trained under Obi-Wan, and Obi-Wan is given the full privileges of knight. That's all politics right there. I'm not going to comment on that extensively, except for one fascinating thing. Yoda disagrees. There's actually a surprising amount you can extrapolate from that one fact. Number one, it means the Council felt strongly enough on this matter to ignore Yoda's advice, and go ahead and confer the rank of Knight and allow Anakin to be his Padawan. That is hugely significant. Number two, it's indicative of the fact that Yoda is wise enough to recognize that this is overall a pretty bad idea, and doing so is probably going to end badly. Even if he can't tell how specifically, Yoda has the experience and the connection with the Force sufficient enough to say this is wrong. And of all the council members, the only one who had that connection and experience was Yoda, to tell that it was wrong. And the third point, this is the best one of all, that Yoda, despite being right, goes about it in all the wrong ways. That Yoda is so stuck in his own rut, his own stagnant perspective of how things should be and must be, that he basically refuses to evolve or adapt or otherwise change his own method of existing or of operating, because he is insistent that the rules should be followed regardless. That's his big concern. He mentioned that several times, remember? And he thinks that those rules exist for a reason, and therefore that they should follow those rules. That will become very significant to Yoda's character arc in Episode 3. My throat actually hurts. I don't know how long I've been talking, but my god, I hope you've enjoyed. Because I have, and we're going to keep going. I'm looking forward to the next one. I'm really looking forward to the next one, and then I am super looking forward to the original trilogy. I will see you guys out there.